The sea has always seemed eternal, a cradle of civilizations and a mirror of the sky. The Mediterranean in particular stands as one of Earth's great theatres, where continents touch, cultures entwine, and histories collide. Today it is a basin of blue stretching from the cliffs of Gibraltar to the shores of the Levant, yet there was a time when this sea almost ceased to exist. Beneath its calm surface lies a buried memory of desolation, when water fled, coastlines crumbled, and a salt desert wider than imagination stretched under the burning sun. This vanished chapter belongs to what scientists call the Messinian Salinity Crisis, a geological event that unfolded nearly 6 million years ago. Driven by the collision of tectonic plates and the rise of natural barriers, the sea became cut off from the Atlantic, its lifeline severed. The ocean's absence transformed the familiar into the alien. Valleys deepened into canyons. Ancient rivers carved trenches that still lie hidden beneath today's waves, and salt crystallized into mountain-sized deposits. Fossils reveal creatures stranded in a dying world, while sediments whisper of storms that never found a shore. To imagine the Mediterranean gone is to face the fragility of what seems immutable. It is to see a future embedded in the past, where climate and stone conspire to overturn the balance of life. This is the story of a sea that disappeared, and of the scars it left behind, scars still shaping the landscapes, cultures, and myths of our present. Welcome to Arcane Skies. Like and subscribe if you wish to journey deeper into forgotten worlds, and leave a comment sharing where and when you are watching this moment unfold. In the beginning, there is silence, an ancient hush stretched across a continent where Europe leans into Africa, and the restless crust of the earth groans beneath invisible pressures. 6 million years ago, the Mediterranean was already old, a sea shaped by the opening and closing of gateways between oceans. Its waters link the Atlantic to the east, and beyond through narrow straits, the Indian Ocean. Yet all of this rested on fragile thresholds of rock, fault lines that trembled under the weight of time. To see this region then is to step into a world that feels familiar and strange. The outlines of Spain, Italy, Greece, and North Africa are recognizable, but their coasts are shifting, raw, still unpolished by the erosion and tectonic quakes that would sculpt them into their modern forms. The land breathed heat. Summers dragged on mercilessly, pressing the atmosphere into a haze, and rivers that fed the sea carried not only fresh water, but entire histories of stone, soil, and the remnants of life. Geological records tell us that these rivers, the Nile, the Rhône, the Po, and countless unnamed streams, were the veins of the Mediterranean, pulsing with the vitality that kept its level steady. The Nile, in particular, descended from the heart of Africa with colossal force, winding through deserts and valleys, delivering nutrients and sediments across vast distances. Every drop was a thread in the fabric of stability, but stability in Earth's terms is always an illusion. At the western edge of the sea lay the Strait of Gibraltar, then a shallow passage compared to its present form, a delicate connection between two immense bodies of water. Imagine it as doorway carved into stone, narrow and vulnerable, exposed to the constant shifts of tectonic motion. The African plate pressed northward against the Eurasian plate, closing the gap in slow but relentless increments. As mountains rose in Iberia and the Rif Range of Morocco, the passage grew constricted, and the connection to the Atlantic weakened. To the creatures of that age, shoals of fish, pods of dolphins, ancient whales, it must have been imperceptible, a change spread across countless generations. Yet for the sea itself, it was the prelude to catastrophe. What happens when a sea is sealed off from its source? To understand, one must look at the balance between evaporation and replenishment. In modern times, the Mediterranean loses more water to the sun than it gains from rivers, its deficit compensated only by the constant inflow from the Atlantic. Without that inflow, it becomes a closed bowl. its surface shrinking day by day beneath a sky of relentless heat. The Messinian epoch carried climates prone to extremes, periods of drought punctuated by sudden storms. With the Atlantic's lifeline cut, evaporation raced ahead unchecked. The sea began to wither. As the water withdrew, coastlines extended outward into barren plains. Once submerged shelves cracked open to reveal canyons carved by rivers now plunging hundreds, even thousands of feet lower. The Nile, robbed of its final destination, sliced into the earth with ferocious energy, creating a gorge deeper than the Grand Canyon. In Spain, the Ebro River etched valleys so profound that today's seabed still bears their ghostly outlines. What had been a marine sanctuary turned into a desert of salt, shimmering under the sun like an endless mirage. Scientists studying seismic profiles of the seafloor have traced these drowned landscapes, riverbeds fossilized beneath miles of sediment, a reminder of a vanished world where ships could have sailed on what is now dry land. But to think of it as an empty basin would be misleading. Life, resilient and opportunistic, adapted in strange and unexpected ways. Salt-tolerant organisms clung to shrinking lagoons, evolving in isolation. Pools of hypersaline brine fostered extremophils, microorganisms capable of thriving in conditions lethal to most forms of life. The fossil record reveals tiny shells of foraminifera, microscopic plankton that record the changing chemistry of water in their delicate walls. Each shell is a diary of decline, a whisper of survival in an environment collapsing around it. Above, the sky would have carried storms dense with dust, swirling over deserts that had once been seabeds. Winds funneled salt crystals into dunes, coating the land in white sheets that reflected sunlight like a frozen landscape, though the heat was crushing. For animals roaming nearby, early elephants, antelopes, predators prowling the fringes of Africa, this transformation must have been bewildering. Herds that once found water along Mediterranean shores were forced to migrate deeper into the continent, driving evolutionary pressures that shaped their descendants. The drying of the sea was not only a geological upheaval, but an ecological shockwave. Yet silence never lasted. As the basin descended into desolation, the Earth's crust continued to shift. Faults cracked, volcanoes stirred, and deep within the seabed, pressure mounted. Beneath the deposits of salt, layers upon layers accumulating to depths of 2 kilometers, new minerals crystallized, sealing evidence of the crisis. These salt mountains remain entombed under today's Mediterranean, their presence confirmed by drilling expeditions in the 20th century. Each core sample lifted from the depths carries the unmistakable fingerprint of this vanished era. Halite crystals glinting in artificial light, relics of a sea undone by time. But perhaps the most haunting image of all is not the salt nor the empty plains, but the rivers, those relentless sculptors of stone. Deprived of an outlet, they tore into the land with a fury unmatched in modern times. Imagine standing at the edge of the Messinian Nile Gorge, a chasm carved not by tectonics but by the desperate flow of water chasing a vanished horizon. Depths of several kilometers yawned into the earth, a wound so vast it made the future Grand Canyon appear modest. These scars were later drowned when the sea returned, hidden from view, yet their shape still influences currents, sediments, and even human engineering today. The Mediterranean's disappearance was not a single moment, but a drawn-out spectacle of decline, a theatre where geology and climate performed in slow motion. Decades became centuries, centuries stretched into hundreds of thousands of years, and with each passing era the basin oscillated between extremes, brief floods when water seeped back in, followed by renewed desiccation. It was a cycle of death and return, like a tide stretched across geological time. And as the stage was set for one of the most dramatic refloodings in Earth's history, the land itself seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the next act. Beyond the silence of the salt plains, beyond the canyons carved into the deep, there loomed the inevitability of return. Water, after all, is patient. It carves, seeps, presses, and in time, it always finds its way. At the western edge, the barrier that sealed off the Atlantic was never eternal. Beneath its weight, fractures widened, and the whisper of the ocean lingered beyond the horizon. Somewhere, far off, waves pounded against stone with the persistence of eternity, preparing for the moment when the door would once again open and the sea would rush back to reclaim what had been lost. The memory of absence lingers in stone. To walk across the floor of the vanished Mediterranean 6 million years ago would have been to traverse a realm of paradox. The remnants of a sea sculpted into desert, a basin hollowed out by retreating waters, yet alive with strange vitality. In the distance, fractured cliffs rose where once there had been gentle continental shelves. Vast salt pans stretched in dazzling brightness, the ground crusted white and shimmering like ice, though the air burned with heat. The horizon quivered with mirages, and the wind carried a bitter tang that stung the tongue and dried the lungs. This was not an ordinary desert, but one of salt and silence, carved from the bones of a vanished sea. Geologists today can trace the magnitude of this transformation in layers buried deep beneath the seabed. The salt deposits alone are staggering, measured not in meters, but in kilometers, in volumes equal to millions of cubic kilometers of crystallized sea. Imagine entire mountain ranges made of salt, stacked upon one another in dazzling layers of halite, gypsum, and anhydrite. These strata, uncovered by deep drilling in the 20th century, are silent witnesses to an epoch when evaporation outpaced life. To an ancient traveller stumbling across this expanse, the glittering landscape might have seemed otherworldly, as if the earth had been scoured by fire and replaced with a mirage of glass. Yet amid this desolation, rivers continued their work. Their waters, no longer flowing into a vibrant sea, cascaded down into deepening canyons. The Nile was transformed into a super river, plunging through a gorge thousands of feet deep, its course slicing through rock in pursuit of a basin that kept receding beyond reach. Fossilized remnants suggest that waterfalls of inconceivable scale may have thundered into these voids, their roar echoing across lifeless plains. Imagine cataracts taller than skyscrapers, sheets of water collapsing into basins so deep they disappeared in mist before striking the bottom. These waterfalls, now buried beneath sediment, were fleeting monuments to a sea in retreat. Life, though wounded, endured. The Mediterranean's disappearance did not extinguish its ecosystems outright, but forced them into pockets of survival. Inland lakes persisted where depressions caught what little remained of water. Brackish lagoons harboured mollusks and crustaceans adapted to hypersalinity, their shells recording shifts in chemistry with each delicate layer. Microbes colonised the brine pools, extremophiles thriving where no other life could endure. These organisms tell a story of resilience, their survival strategies mirrored today in isolated environments like the Dead Sea or hypersaline lakes in East Africa. Each living cell became an experiment in endurance, a spark carried through time across conditions that seemed unbearable. Beyond the basin, the surrounding continents bore the marks of upheaval. Europe's southern margins warped and lifted, reshaping coastlines and raising mountain chains whose outlines remain today. Africa pressed northward, compressing land into new ridges and tightening the lock on Gibraltar. This relentless tectonic motion did more than shape geography, it altered climate. By draining the Mediterranean, atmospheric circulation was disrupted, reshaping wind patterns across continents. Dust from the salt desert lofted into the sky, scattering sunlight and seeding clouds that rarely found moisture to release. Some climate models suggest that the desiccation of this vast basin may have accelerated the spread of arid conditions in North Africa, a foreshadowing of the Sahara's expansion. The ecological consequences radiated outward. Animals that once roamed Mediterranean coasts now faced a shifting world. herds of antelopes, elephants and rhinoceroses, dependent on rivers and fertile valleys, were pushed into harsher habitats. Predators followed, adapting or perishing. Fossils from this era, discovered in North Africa and southern Europe, show abrupt transitions in species distributions. Some lineages vanished, unable to cope with new climates. Others migrated, bridging continents when sea level drop revealed land corridors previously hidden beneath shallow water. The crisis transformed the Mediterranean from a barrier into a bridge, a crossroads for migration that altered the evolutionary course of countless species. For early primates scattered across Africa and Eurasia, these shifts may have been decisive. As forest retreated under drier conditions, grasslands expanded, pressuring species to adapt to new diets, new forms of locomotion, and new strategies for survival. Some anthropologists speculate that events like the Messinian Salinity Crisis contributed indirectly to the evolutionary pressures shaping hominin ancestors. Though separated by millions of years, the echoes of the vanished sea may still ripple in the trajectory of human origins. The cultural imagination, had there been observers, would have been overwhelmed. A sea disappearing within the span of generations would appear apocalyptic, a divine punishment or cosmic upheaval. Later myths of floods and vanished waters may carry distant whispers of this ancient desiccation, transmitted not by witnesses but by landscapes whose scars became part of human memory when our species eventually walked those shores. To stand at the lip of a canyon carved by a vanished Nile, to see salt mountains exposed in sunlit brilliance, would have been to encounter a mystery too vast for words. Yet the earth is never static. Even in this desolation, forces were gathering for reversal. The barrier at Gibraltar, the fragile dam of stone that severed the Mediterranean from the Atlantic, was not invincible. Beneath its weight, fractures deepened. Erosion worked ceaselessly, assisted by seismic tremors that shook the ground. The Atlantic pressed outward, a vast ocean yearning to return, its tides hammering against the edge of confinement. Slowly, imperceptibly, weaknesses spread, like cracks in a dam holding back a reservoir. The imbalance between the parched basin and the surging Atlantic grew unbearable. The potential energy stored in this contrast is almost beyond comprehension. On one side lay a desert basin, the sea level thousands of feet below the open Atlantic. On the other side, the weight of the ocean towered above, straining to burst through. When at last the threshold gave way, the result would be a cataclysm without equal, a deluge that would rewrite landscapes in days. But in the interim, as the basin baked and rivers clawed downward, the earth rehearsed its drama, preparing for one of the most spectacular events in geological history, the Zanclean flood. And so, in the deep silence of a vanished sea, with rivers carving wounds deeper each year, with salt plains glinting under a sun that refused mercy, the stage was set. The Atlantic waited just beyond the stone, its presence like a distant heartbeat. The question was not if the water would return, but when, and with what ferocity. The silence of the Mediterranean basin was deceptive, for nothing in Earth's story remained still for long. Beneath the salt-encrusted plains and the yawning gorges carved by rivers, the crust itself shifted restlessly. 6 million years ago, the collision of Africa and Eurasia was more than a meeting of continents. It was a grinding, ceaseless negotiation written in earthquakes, in uplifted ridges, in the folding and fracturing of rock. The vanished sea lay at the mercy of forces invisible to any eye, yet immense enough to reorder entire landscapes. To imagine this world is to see a basin no longer filled with water, but with heat, dust, and salt. At its edges, cliffs stood exposed like colossal scars, their strata revealed to the sun in colours of ochre, grey, and crimson. Within the basin, vast plains stretched toward the horizon, cracked like old pottery, streaked with veins of crystallized salt. The ground was treacherous, solid underfoot in one place, yet collapsing into brine-soaked mud in another. In certain depressions, hypersaline lakes shimmered darkly, poisonous mirrors that trapped heat and reflected the barren sky. To stand here was to feel both awe and unease, as if walking upon the corpse of a sea that had not yet finished dying. The air itself carried evidence of the sea's absence. Winds swept across exposed sediments, lifting fine dust into storms that could blot out the sun. These tempests carried salt far beyond the basin, sprinkling the surrounding continents with a bitter residue. Climate models suggest that these dust clouds may have altered rainfall patterns across Europe and North Africa, spreading aridity and reshaping ecosystems hundreds of miles away. What occurred in the Mediterranean did not stay confined to its hollow. It rippled outward, shifting the balance of life across continents. Animals, compelled by survival, adapted or perished in response. Herds of ungulates, once accustomed to verdant coastal plains, found those lands gone, replaced by salt flats and canyons. Fossil evidence indicates waves of migration, animals crossing what were newly exposed land bridges where shallow seafloors had dried. Antelopes, camels, and elephants moved between Africa and Europe, their paths redrawn by geology. Predators followed, big cats, hyenas, and ancient canids, trailing the herds into new territories. The vanished sea had become a corridor, a highway for life that altered the genetic fabric of populations and introduced predators and prey to unfamiliar landscapes. Yet the Mediterranean's emptiness was never uniform. In some pockets, water lingered stubbornly. Deep depressions became saline lakes, each a miniature universe of survival. Microbial mats spread across their margins, feeding off sunlight and nutrients concentrated in brine. Strange chemical reactions unfolded in these extreme environments. Sulfur-laden waters bubbled with gases, and minerals precipitated into bizarre crystalline structures. To modern scientists, these remnants echo in hypersaline lakes like Ethiopia's Lake Assal or the Dead Sea, where life clings to inhospitable extremes. In studying them, one glimpses the tenacity of existence during the Messinian Crisis. Rivers remained relentless sculptors. The Nile, the Rhone, and the Po deepened their channels, digging into continental crust with ferocity, unleashed by the falling base level of the Mediterranean. The Nile Gorge, descending thousands of meters, became a scar of unimaginable scale, its sheer cliffs testifying to the desperation of water chasing a vanishing horizon. Such rivers created canyons larger than any seen today, yet their beauty was fleeting. When the sea eventually returned, these canyons were drowned, their grandeur buried beneath layers of new sediment. Their presence is known only through seismic imaging, ghostly outlines hidden below the seafloor, unseen yet monumental. Salt, more than stone, became the signature of this age. Kilometers thick layers accumulated, weighing upon the crust, deforming under pressure, creeping slowly in subterranean flows. These salt deposits, still present today, play strange roles in Earth's mechanics. They act as lubricants for tectonic shifts, reservoirs for oil and gas, and traps for mineral wealth. In the deep time of the Messinian, they were monuments of absence, mountains of salt left behind where an ocean had evaporated into sky. The Mediterranean's disappearance was etched not just into landscapes, but into chemistry, its memory stored in crystals that gleam when unearthed by drilling cores. From a distance, perhaps from the high ridges of Iberia or the peaks of the Atlas Mountains, the view into the basin must have been haunting. A once glittering sea, source of storms and life, had become a void. Clouds of dust swirled where waves once rolled, and winds whispered across plains where dolphins and whales had once danced. To early primates in Africa's forests, though unaware of its cause, the shifting climate influenced by this event may have altered food, habitat, and migration in ways that nudged evolution along new paths. The crisis was not a local anomaly, but a chapter written into the grand story of life. And always, beyond the edge of this desolation, the Atlantic waited. its waters pressed against Gibraltar, testing the barrier that held them back. Seismic tremors shook the earth, tiny previews of rupture. The difference in level between ocean and basin grew monstrous, a vertical wall of potential energy, a promise of cataclysm. The dam at Gibraltar was fragile, built not by human hands but by tectonic coincidence, and like any barrier it was temporary. What would it mean for the Atlantic to break through? Modern models attempt to imagine the Zanclean flood, a deluge that could have refilled the basin in as little as 2 years, perhaps even months. If so, the torrent would have unleashed waterfalls thousands of times greater than Niagara, a wall of water racing inward at speeds beyond comprehension. Valleys would have flooded in hours, canyons drowned in days, salt plains swallowed in roaring torrents that carved new channels. The Mediterranean would not return quietly, it would roar back in violence. But in this interval, before the flood, the basin stood still in its paradoxical state, dead yet alive, barren yet fertile with possibility. Its silence was punctuated by the rush of rivers, the howl of dust storms, the crackle of salt crust fracturing in the heat. It was a place of extremes, a glimpse into how fragile the balance of oceans truly is. And though it lay hidden in deep time, the lesson it carried was timeless. That seas, like civilizations, can vanish, and that what seems eternal is always waiting to be undone. Still the Atlantic gathered its strength. Still the cracks in Gibraltar widened, grain by grain, tremor by tremor. And deep in the basin, where salt dunes rose like frozen waves, the air carried the faintest trace of moisture, a whisper of water yet to come, heralding the flood that would erase this desert and drown its silence forever. In the long silence before the flood, the Mediterranean basin became a crucible of extremes. From the rim of the Iberian Peninsula to the jagged shoulders of Crete, the air shimmered with heat, and the hollow floor stretched out in a vast white desolation. Yet beneath this apparent stillness, the Earth's restless dynamics continued to shape the fate of the vanished sea. The Messinian Salinity Crisis was not a single, uniform event, but a complex rhythm of drying and partial refilling, a cycle where the basin teetered between ocean and desert, never fully either, caught in a fragile balance that could collapse at any moment. At times, temporary floods swept through, when cracks in the barrier allowed surges of Atlantic water to spill inward. These were not full restorations, but half measures, torrents that drowned salt plains in brackish lakes before the passage closed again. Geological records bear witness in alternating layers, deposits of salt overlain by marine sediments, then again capped by evaporates. Each stratum is a line in Earth's diary, written in minerals instead of words. These fluctuations may have persisted for hundreds of thousands of years, an uneasy dance between absence and return. To creatures that endured through it, the sea must have seemed capricious, now a sanctuary, now a trap. The rivers played their part in this oscillating drama. Each brief refilling reset their courses, only for renewed desiccation to carve them deeper still. The Nile Gorge, already immense, was periodically flooded, its depths transformed into lakes that boiled under desert heat. When waters withdrew, the river resumed its carving deeper and deeper, as if chasing a horizon that kept receding. The Rhone carved through southern France, the Po cut into Italy's plains, and streams across North Africa etched ravines whose shapes are still faintly visible today, in seismic reflections beneath the seabed. Every drop of water was both an architect and an executioner, sculpting landscapes destined to be buried. The salt plains were never uniform deserts. In some places they rose into jagged ridges as tectonic shifts deformed the accumulating layers. In others, they collapsed into depressions where brine collected in deadly pools. These hypersaline lakes shimmered black under the sun, their surfaces broken by bubbles of trapped gases rising from beneath. Around them, life found improbable footholds. Mats of cyanobacteria spread like thin carpets, metabolizing sunlight in waters that would kill most organisms. Small crustaceans, adapted to brine, darted through the shallows, and mollusks evolved shells that could withstand chemical onslaught. Each was a testament to the ingenuity of life under siege, a whisper of resilience echoing through time. The climate outside the basin bore scars of this desiccation. Dust storms carried fine grains of salt and silt high into the atmosphere, scattering across Europe and North Africa. These particles seeded clouds, altering rainfall patterns. Some regions, once fertile, began to dry, while others received sudden, unpredictable deluges. In North Africa, the spread of aridity accelerated, pushing ecosystems towards savanna and desert. This expansion may have set the stage for the Sahara's future dominance, an indirect legacy of the vanished sea. In Europe, pollen records suggest shifts in vegetation. Forests retreated, replaced by more drought-tolerant plants, reshaping the habitats of countless species. The ecological consequences rippled across continents. Herds of herbivores moved in search of stable water and grasslands, their migrations redrawing the map of life. Fossil sites from Spain to Morocco capture abrupt shifts in faunal communities. Animals that had once been confined to Africa appear in Europe, while others disappeared entirely. These migrations were not accidents, but forced journeys across newly exposed corridors, passages carved by the retreat of the sea. The Mediterranean, once a barrier, had become a bridge. Predators stalked this bridge too, expanding their range. The balance of ecosystems shifted, rewriting the rules of survival in a world reshaped by geology. For early primates, though separated by millions of years from modern humans, the echoes of this event may have been profound. As climates shifted and forests gave way to open grasslands, evolutionary pressures mounted. Bipedalism, dietary flexibility, and new patterns of social behaviour were responses to an environment in flux. Though the Messinian Salinity Crisis predates the earliest hominins, its climatic aftershocks may have rippled forward into the evolutionary crucible of Africa, indirectly influencing the trajectory that would one day lead to humanity. The disappearance of a sea may seem distant, but its fingerprints linger in the unfolding of life. And yet this desolate world was not without beauty. Imagine standing at the edge of what is now Sicily, gazing out over the basin. Instead of the glittering sea we know, one would have seen an endless expanse of salt and dust, punctuated by shimmering lakes and canyons that plunged into the earth. The horizon rippled with heat, but in the distance, mirages painted ghostly images of water that did not exist. At night the air cooled abruptly, and stars shone with piercing clarity, reflected faintly in the black surfaces of brine pools. The silence was vast, broken only by the whisper of wind across salt crusts and the distant roar of waterfalls plunging into abyssal gorges. But beauty carried menace. The salt plains were unstable, their crust cracking underfoot, sometimes collapsing into hidden brine pits that could swallow entire animals. Dust storms swept across the basin, choking lungs and blinding eyes. Water, when it appeared, was often poison, too laden with salt to drink. For the creatures that ventured here, survival was a gamble, and many perished in the attempt. Fossilized remains of mammals and birds, found entombed in salt deposits, speak of lives cut short in an unforgiving land. Each skeleton is a reminder of the risks taken in pursuit of scarce water and food. The Atlantic, meanwhile, never relented. Beyond Gibraltar, its waves pounded against the narrow land bridge, each swell pressing against the dam of stone. Seismic tremors loosened the rock, erosion chipped away grain by grain, and subterranean fractures widened. The imbalance grew unbearable. An ocean on one side, a desert basin on the other, separated by only a fragile threshold. The longer the sea remained absent, the greater the difference in level became, until the stage was set for an event of unimaginable violence. The basin itself seemed to anticipate its fate. Rivers deepened as if preparing channels for water yet to come. Salt plains, fractured and brittle, waited to dissolve. Canyons yawned like empty conduits, ready to be filled. The silence of the Mediterranean desert was not finality but pause, the stillness before a storm of staggering scale. And so the question lingered across this barren world. When would the barrier break, and what would it mean for the land, for the rivers, for the fragile web of life clinging to the edges of the basin? Somewhere beyond the horizon, the Atlantic stirred with patience, its tides relentless, its weight unbearable, biding its time until the day it would reclaim the void and drown the silence forever. The waiting basin, scorched and silent, was a landscape poised on the edge of transformation. It had endured cycles of filling and retreat, of shallow seas that glimmered only briefly before the sun reclaimed them, leaving behind the shining crust of salt. Now, with each passing millennium, the imbalance grew sharper. The Atlantic swelled against its barrier, the Mediterranean basin deepened in thirst, and the tension between absence and return became unbearable. The world was bracing for the flood, though no creature could know it. Geological evidence allows us to reconstruct the scale of this imbalance with chilling precision. At its lowest point, the Mediterranean basin may have sunk nearly 2 miles below sea level. To stand there would have been to look upward at cliffs so high they rivaled the Himalayas, their slopes etched by rivers that had been forced into desperate descent. The difference in water levels between the Atlantic and the parched basin created what scientists call a hydraulic head, a stored force as vast and inevitable as gravity itself. It was not a question of if the dam would give way, but when. Yet before the rupture came, the basin endured extremes that tested every form of life. Dust storms swept across plains of salt, rising like living walls and choking the horizon in clouds of white and ochre. Rivers narrowed into canyons, carved labyrinths into stone where once they had wandered freely across fertile plains. In depressions, black lakes of brine shimmered ominously, rich with sulphur and methane. Their waters boiled under the sun, releasing fumes that would have suffocated animals that ventured too close. Even so, extremophiles, microbes adapted to the lethal chemistry, thrived in these pools, feeding on minerals and light, weaving delicate microbial mats that draped the edges of the lakes. The salt itself was both foundation and ruin. Mountains of it rose beneath the basin, layers upon layers of halite and gypsum pressing down on the crust with unimaginable weight. Over time, these deposits deformed, flowing like plastic beneath pressure, creating domes and ridges that warped the landscape. These subterranean movements sometimes fractured the ground above, unleashing collapses that swallowed valleys whole. In some places, the salt forced its way upward in massive diapirs, pillars of crystalline rock that pierced younger sediments like frozen geysers. Even now, beneath the seafloor of the modern Mediterranean, these salt structures lie hidden, immense monuments to the vanished sea. The creatures that skirted the basin's rim bore witness to its volatility. Herds of mammals migrating across the exposed land corridors occasionally strayed too far into the heart of the desert, drawn by mirages of water or traces of vegetation clinging to the margins of brine pools. Fossils tell of elephants, antelopes and horses succumbing to the trap of salt, their remains preserved in crystalline tombs. Birds, too, lured by glints of reflected light, may have plunged into hypersaline waters from which escape was impossible. Each life lost became part of the geological record, a frozen moment in the long narrative of disappearance. But while life on the ground struggled, the sky above seemed to foreshadow change. Moisture rising from the Atlantic formed clouds that swept eastward, breaking into storms when they collided with mountain ranges. Lightning split the skies over Iberia and Morocco, and torrential rains occasionally spilled into the basin. Yet without a true outlet, these waters only pooled temporarily, evaporating as quickly as they had come. The basin remained a vast trap, swallowing rivers and storms, never satisfied, never stable. For geologists, the anticipation of the flood is one of the most compelling mysteries of the Messinian. When the Atlantic finally breached Gibraltar, did it happen in a single apocalyptic moment, or through a series of smaller incursions that gradually eroded the barrier? Evidence points to a sudden, catastrophic rupture, the so-called Zanclean flood, which may have refilled the basin in as little as a few months. If true, this sight would have been beyond imagination. Waterfalls taller than any mountain, torrents roaring inward with a force that dwarfed every river on earth. Waterfalls at Gibraltar may have reached heights of nearly a mile, plunging into a chasm as deep as the Grand Canyon, unleashing energy equivalent to thousands of nuclear bombs. Yet before that day arrived, the basin persisted in its liminal state, a world of paradox and extremes. It was a desert made of ocean, a canyon deeper than mountains, a landscape at once barren and alive. For the animals and plants that skirted its margins, survival depended on mobility and adaptation. For the rivers, it was a relentless descent into ever-deepening wounds. For the salt plains, it was an age of stillness, waiting for the touch of water to dissolve them back into nothingness. Standing on the high cliffs above what is now Gibraltar, one could almost hear the Atlantic whispering against stone, its pressure building, its tides restless. The barrier that held it back was fragile, born of tectonic uplift and destined to fail. Deep fractures spread beneath its surface, invisible but widening with each tremor. To the west, waves surged ceaselessly against the rock, their weight pounding in rhythms older than memory. To the east, the basin yawned in silence, its air shimmering, its salt crust glowing faintly under the brutal sun. The contrast was unbearable. Abundance against absence, ocean against desert, life against silence. Somewhere within that imbalance lay inevitability. The day would come when stone yielded, when fractures widened into channels, when the Atlantic found its way through, and when it did, the transformation would be so sudden, so violent, that the Mediterranean's desert would vanish almost overnight. The salt plains would dissolve, the gorges would drown, and the silence would be replaced by a roar that echoed across continents. But here, in this waiting age, the Mediterranean remained a paradoxical monument to impermanence. It was proof that seas can vanish, that oceans are fragile, that even the most enduring landscapes are only temporary chapters in Earth's story. And as the sun burned down upon its salt-white expanse, the air itself seemed to hold a question. How long could such a world endure before water returned to claim it once more? The answer lay beyond the horizon, in the restless tides of the Atlantic, in waves that had never ceased their pounding, in fractures that spread silently in stone. It was a question of time and of force, and the earth itself seemed to lean forward, waiting for the flood to come. The last days of the Mediterranean desert unfolded with a tension that the land itself seemed to feel. The basin had endured millions of years as a paradox, neither truly sea nor truly land, but a hollow carved from absence. Yet by the close of the Messinian epoch, the forces of inevitability pressed harder. The Atlantic loomed like a patient predator beyond Gibraltar, its waters swelling with the quiet persistence of tides. Each day the imbalance grew sharper, an ocean perched high on one side, a desert sunken deep on the other. Gravity was waiting for a weakness, and geology was preparing to deliver it. The barrier at Gibraltar was no monolith of permanence. It was a fragile dam, an accident of tectonic uplift forged when the African and Eurasian plates collided. Beneath its surface ran faults and fractures, invisible seams of weakness widened by seismic tremors and the relentless grinding of plates. Rainfall from surrounding highlands eroded its flanks. Subterranean water seeping through limestone dissolved the stone grain by grain, and always waves from the Atlantic pounded its western face, carving fissures with each surge. From above it may have seemed unyielding, from within it was hollowing. Scientists imagine this threshold as the single most fragile point in the story, the fulcrum upon which the fate of the Mediterranean turned. The pressure difference was staggering. On the Atlantic side, water stood thousands of feet higher than the parched basin below. On the Mediterranean side, air shimmered above salt flats and canyons. The hydraulic head, the vertical difference, represented an ocean straining against a desert. If released suddenly, the flood would become one of the most violent natural events in Earth's history. But in the meantime, the basin bore the scars of anticipation. Rivers continued to carve their way downward, their gorges descending deeper than the mind can comprehend. The Nile Gorge, already several kilometres deep, may have carried torrents of water that ended not in an ocean, but in plunging waterfalls, disappearing into a basin that drank them dry. Each canyon was a wound opened by time, a passageway prepared for the water that would one day return. The land was readying itself, sculpted into channels awaiting a tide that had not yet come. The animals that skirted the basin's rim sensed nothing of the titanic forces beneath their feet. For them, the world was changing in subtle but relentless ways. Grasslands expanded where once forests had stood, driven by shifts in rainfall as dust from the basin altered skies. Herds of antelope and elephants migrated across new corridors exposed by the sea's retreat. Predators followed, reshaping the balance of survival. Fossil evidence captures these moments of movement. Species that once lived apart now mingled, while others vanished entirely. The Mediterranean desert was not merely a place of silence, but a hinge in the history of life, a crossroads of extinction and migration. Even in its desolation, the basin harboured strange forms of vitality. Brine lakes dotted the lowest depressions, their waters dense with salt, their surfaces glinting black under the sun. Around them grew microbial mats, resilient sheets of life weaving across toxic shores. These extremophils thrived in conditions lethal to most, their metabolism a chemistry of survival honed by crisis. For geologists and biologists, they are windows into the persistence of life, reminders that even at the edges of possibility, existence adapts. Such resilience offers a glimpse into what life on other worlds might endure, Mars, Europa, or beyond, where salt, rock, and thin atmospheres replace oceans and forests. Yet beauty and menace coexisted in equal measure. Imagine standing at the edge of what is now Sicily or Crete, looking out across the hollow. The horizon shimmered white, broken by jagged cliffs plunging into shadow. Winds whistled across salt crusts, carrying the tang of minerals sharp in the nose. The ground beneath one's feet was brittle, prone to collapse into hidden brine pits. Dust storms rose suddenly, sweeping across the plains like advancing armies. To early animals and plants, the basin was both temptation and trap, a place of mirages and poisoned waters, a void carved into the heart of continents. Above it all, the sky carried the quiet promise of change. Moisture rose from the Atlantic and drifted eastward, falling as storms across Europe and North Africa. Some of that rain found its way into the basin, feeding temporary lakes that evaporated as quickly as they formed. Each rainfall was a rehearsal, a reminder that water was always near, always pressing against the threshold. Every drop hinted at the inevitable deluge yet to come. When geologists drill into the Mediterranean seafloor today, they find the fingerprints of these oscillations, layers of evaporates capped by marine sediments, then evaporates again. The record tells of a basin that flickered between two states, filled and empty, ocean and desert. These cycles may have stretched across hundreds of thousands of years, each one a reminder that stability was never possible. The Mediterranean was a place caught between worlds, destined to shift violently back into one of them. The sheer scale of the coming flood is nearly impossible to fathom. Models suggest that when the Atlantic finally breached Gibraltar, the flow could have reached 100 million cubic meters of water every second, thousands of times greater than the Amazon. The roar would have been heard across continents, the vibrations felt in stone for miles. Waterfalls taller than Everest's summit would have cascaded into the void, carving new channels, erasing salt plains in hours. Within months, the basin could have been filled, transformed from desert to sea in a cataclysm of speed unmatched in geological history. But for now, in this chapter of waiting, the Mediterranean remained a hollow of silence and extremes. Its rivers deepened their scars. Its animals migrated in search of balance. Its skies carried dust and salt into distant lands. And at Gibraltar, stone continued to fracture, grain by grain, tremor by tremor, under the relentless pounding of tides. The question was not whether the barrier would fall, but how sudden its surrender would be. Would water seep slowly at first, trickling into streams that widened into torrents? Or would the rock give way in a single thunderous moment, unleashing a flood that would redefine the map of Earth? In the silence of the desert basin, the answer waited beyond the horizon, in the restless patience of the Atlantic Ocean. The day the flood began was unlike any other in Earth's story. It did not arrive with a whisper, nor with the gentle return of tides. It arrived with a rupture, sudden and merciless, as the Atlantic finally broke through its fragile threshold at Gibraltar. For millions of years, water had pressed against the barrier, its weight a constant force waiting only for weakness. When the stone yielded, the result was a cascade so violent, so immense, that it reshaped the destiny of an entire basin in the blink of geological time. The breach may have begun with a fracture, perhaps an earthquake loosened rock, or subterranean erosion hollowed the limestone until it collapsed. What began as trickles of water quickly widened into torrents, each surge carving deeper into the channel. Within days, the breach became a waterfall of almost inconceivable scale, plunging into the abyss of the Mediterranean basin below. Scientists estimate the drop could have been over a mile higher than any waterfall on Earth today. Imagine a curtain of water thundering into the void, a roar that shook the ground for miles, echoing like the voice of the ocean itself. As the flood accelerated, the Mediterranean basin transformed into a colossal whirlpool of erosion and chaos. Rivers that had carved deep gorges suddenly reversed their purpose, becoming conduits for incoming water. The Nile Gorge, the Rhone Canyon, and countless valleys funneled the deluge deeper into the heart of the basin. Dust storms that had long haunted the salt plains were swept away, drowned beneath torrents that crashed across deserts, dissolving salt layers into brine. Waterfalls poured over cliffs, filling canyons in hours that had taken millions of years to carve. The desert was vanishing before the eyes of everything that lived upon its margins. The sheer scale of flow is difficult to comprehend. Models suggest that at its peak, the flood may have unleashed more than 100 million cubic meters of water every second. That is a torrent greater than every river on Earth combined, unleashed into a single basin. The speed of the flood may have reached 50 miles per hour, a wall of water rushing eastward, carving channels that would shape coastlines for millennia. Entire landscapes disappeared in days, salt plains dissolved, brine lakes became seething seas, and dust-filled skies cleared into storms of rain and spray. Life that had endured the desolation now faced annihilation of another kind. Herds of animals grazing near the basin's rim were swept away by torrents that climbed cliffs and drowned valleys. Predators, birds, and even trees were torn from their ground and carried into the abyss, deposited in chaotic heaps of debris. Fossil records hint at this violence, mixed assemblages of marine and terrestrial species found buried together, as if the sea had swallowed land in one final act of hunger. For microbes and brine dwellers, the sudden influx of fresh water was both catastrophe and opportunity. a resetting of chemistry that extinguished some lineages and opened niches for others. The flood was not a single waterfall but many. Along the fractured rim of the basin, water burst through in cascades from multiple directions. In Sicily and southern Italy, torrents poured through valleys, carving gashes that remain faintly visible today. In the east, the flood spread across plains that had been barren for millions of years, filling depressions that swallowed millions of cubic meters at once. Each cascade carried silt, stone, and shattered salt, creating underwater avalanches that raced ahead of the water. These density currents scoured the seafloor, depositing vast fans of sediment that geologists still find stretching into the deep. For days, then weeks, the roar of falling water never ceased. The sound must have been unlike anything heard before, an endless thunder mingling with the groan of collapsing cliffs and the hiss of boiling spray. The sky above was shrouded with mist, rainbows arching across the deluge, storms feeding storms as evaporation intensified. Lightning cracked across the basin, illuminating walls of water as they crashed downward. In the chaos, the Mediterranean was reborn, not as the quiet sea we know, but as a cauldron of violence. And yet, within this cataclysm, creation was at work. As the waters poured in, they mixed with the hypersaline brines that had lingered in the basin, setting off chemical reactions that precipitated minerals, trapping evidence of the flood in layers still studied today. Marine life swept in from the Atlantic surged into the new sea. Fish shoals, dolphins, and whales that had been absent for millions of years returned in a single generation, their bodies carried inward by the flood. Ecosystems vanished and re-emerged almost overnight, a cycle of extinction and rebirth compressed into months. By the time the flood slowed, the transformation was nearly complete. Within as little as 2 years, perhaps even less, the Mediterranean basin was filled again, restored as a sea that stretched from Gibraltar to the Levant. The salt plains were gone, buried beneath thousands of feet of water. The great gorges carved by rivers were drowned, their outlines hidden beneath sediments. Only the mountains and islands that rose high above the basin's floor remained, their cliffs now coastal, their valleys now drowned fjords. The desert had become ocean once more. For the continents around it, the flood marked a turning point. Climate shifted again as the basin's restored waters altered atmospheric circulation. Rainfall patterns changed across Europe and North Africa, bringing stability back to regions that had endured centuries of drought. Ecosystems, though scarred, began to flourish. Forests regained ground where they had retreated, rivers stabilized, and fertile plains spread once more. The flood was destruction, but it was also renewal, a reset in Earth's vast cycles. And still, the scars of the Messinian remained, hidden beneath the waves. The salt deposits lay buried beneath sediments, silent markers of the sea's disappearance. The drowned canyons of the Nile and the Rhone still exist, concealed below the seafloor, their shapes mapped only by seismic echoes. The geology of the Mediterranean is forever shaped by this catastrophe, its crust warped by salt, its sediments bearing the fingerprints of absence and return. To imagine standing on the cliffs of Gibraltar during that moment is to confront both awe and terror. Before you, an ocean falls into an abyss, a horizon of water racing eastward with unstoppable force. The roar drowns thought, the ground trembles, and the air is filled with spray that glitters like shattered glass. It is a reminder that the Earth's transformations are not always slow, not always gentle, but at times sudden and cataclysmic, rewriting entire landscapes in days. When the flood finally subsided, the Mediterranean was no longer a desert, but a sea reborn. And yet, even in its renewal, questions lingered. What life had been lost forever? What new species would arise in the aftermath? And what lessons would this vanished chapter hold for a future where seas and climates still shift, as fragile as the barrier that once held back an ocean? When the floodwaters of the Atlantic finally stilled, the Mediterranean was no longer the hollow desert it had been for millions of years. It was reborn, blue and vast. A sea returned to its ancient role as crossroads of continents. Yet beneath its glimmering surface lay a secret graveyard, a record of upheaval etched into stone, salt and sediment. The Zanclean flood had been cataclysmic, but what followed was quieter, subtler, though no less profound. Life began to recolonize. Currents resumed their ceaseless dance, and coastlines took on forms that would one day cradle civilizations. Still, the scars of absence lingered, shaping the Mediterranean in ways that remain hidden but powerful. The drowned canyons were among the most striking relics of the vanished age. The Nile Gorge, once a chasm deeper than the Grand Canyon, now lay beneath the surface, its vast cliffs buried in shadow. Rivers that had once plunged into the abyss now flowed gently into the sea, their tumultuous histories concealed under layers of sediment. The Rhone Valley in France and the Po in Italy bore the same fate, their ancient wounds preserved in silence beneath the waves. For millions of years afterward, these hidden chasms would serve as channels for sediment transport, conduits of mud and sand that filled the basin layer by layer, as if the earth itself sought to erase the violence of the past. But erasure was impossible. The salt deposits left behind by the Messinian Salinity Crisis remained entombed beneath the basin. They stretched across the Mediterranean floor in layers miles thick, folded and warped by tectonic pressure. These buried mountains of salt shaped the seafloor above them, creating ridges and domes that guided currents, trapped sediments, and even determined where oil and gas would accumulate millions of years later. The Mediterranean was not simply a sea renewed, it was a sea resting on foundations of salt, its present haunted by the memory of its absence. The return of water unleashed a renaissance of life. Species from the Atlantic poured inward, repopulating the basin in waves. Fish shoals darted into new habitats, while dolphins and whales returned to waters they had not known for millions of years. Shellfish colonized coastlines, and coral reefs began to take root along rocky shores. The sea was young again, and with its youth came opportunity. Ecosystems flourished, evolving rapidly to fill niches left empty by extinction. Yet traces of the old extremes lingered in isolated pockets, brine pools at the seafloor, where hypersaline water trapped in depressions created deadly lakes beneath the ocean, inhospitable to most life but still claimed by extremophile microbes. These dark, hidden reservoirs were echoes of the basin's desert days, preserved in miniature. Climate too felt the transformation. With the basin refilled, evaporation once again fueled clouds, stabilizing rainfall across southern Europe and North Africa. Fertile valleys spread outward, grasses and forests returned, and animal migration shifted yet again. The Sahara, though already a land of aridity, may have paused its expansion, held back for a time by the climatic balance restored by the sea. Across Europe, pollen records show forests thickening, lakes expanding, and biodiversity recovering. The Mediterranean had resumed its role as climate engine, shaping the rhythm of seasons across two continents. Yet the return of the sea was not purely gentle. The flood's violence left behind unstable coastlines. Lands that had been exposed to desert winds and salt for millions of years were suddenly submerged. Valleys filled with brine, cliffs collapsed into the water, and tsunamis likely rippled outward as the sea found equilibrium. In the eastern Mediterranean, where the flood's momentum reached its climax, waves may have swept across coasts with destructive force, reshaping shorelines in hours. For early ecosystems, recovery meant adaptation to instability as well as to abundance. The geological memory of this rebirth remains visible today. In seismic images, scientists can trace the outlines of ancient canyons drowned by the flood. Drill cores reveal transitions from barren salt layers to marine sediments, the exact moment when life returned to the basin. These layers are records of transformation, Pages in Earth's archive describing a catastrophe turned renewal. They remind us that seas are not eternal, that their existence depends on fragile balances between tectonics, climate, and chance. For humanity, which would one day build empires along these shores, the reborn Mediterranean became destiny. Though Homo sapiens appeared millions of years later, the shape of this sea determined the paths of migration, trade, and conquest. The islands formed by drowned mountain ridges became stepping stones for sailors. The fertile valleys nourished agriculture, and the currents carried ships across from Africa to Europe, from Asia to the Atlantic. Without the return of the sea, there would be no Greek islands, no Roman harbours, no Phoenician trade routes, no crossroads of cultures that would shape the story of civilization. The catastrophe of the Messinian Crisis, paradoxically, prepared the stage for the human story. But even as the Mediterranean was restored, its past whispered from beneath. Brine pools at the seafloor, salt diapirs warping sediments, canyons hidden in darkness, all testified to fragility. To geologists, these features are not only reminders of the past, but warnings of the future. The Earth's plates continue to shift and climate continues to oscillate. Seas can vanish and return. What happened 6 million years ago was not a myth, but a cycle, one that could, under the right conditions, occur again. To imagine this is to feel the precariousness of our own world. Today, the Mediterranean still loses more water to evaporation than it gains from rivers. Only the constant inflow from the Atlantic keeps it alive. If that gateway were ever sealed again, by tectonics, by climate, by chance, the sea would begin to retreat once more, repeating its ancient story. The Messinian Crisis is not just a relic of prehistory. It is a reminder that oceans are fragile, that they depend on thresholds that can close as easily as they open. Standing at Gibraltar today, where the Atlantic flows endlessly into the Mediterranean, it is difficult to picture absence. The tides surge with apparent eternity, feeding the basin that sprawls eastward in shimmering blue. But beneath those waves, buried in salt and sediment, lies a truth written by time. The sea we see is not eternal, and the silence of its desert still lingers in the memory of stone. And so the reborn Mediterranean became a paradox of its own, an ocean of abundance resting on the bones of a vanished desert, a sea filled with life, yet haunted by the ghost of its own disappearance. And as civilizations would one day rise along its shores, they too would inherit this paradox, a sea that seems eternal yet once proved it could vanish. In the aftermath of the Zanclean flood, the Mediterranean Sea settled into its new form, wide and blue, a shimmering expanse stretching once again between continents. Yet even as calm waters returned, the land and the life surrounding it were still reeling from the upheaval. Recovery in geological terms is never immediate. The rebirth of the Mediterranean brought stability, but beneath the surface, in hidden valleys and buried salt plains, the memory of its disappearance lingered. It was a world reshaped not only by catastrophe, but by the endurance of what followed. The drowned canyons of the Nile, the Rhône, and the Po were now hidden beneath hundreds of meters of water, but their presence continued to influence the flow of sediments. Every river that entered the sea brought mud, sand, and organic debris, which slid into those great chasms, slowly filling them over millions of years. These layers became archives of recovery, capturing traces of plant pollen, fish bones, and the chemistry of ancient waters. Geologists who study them today can reconstruct the gradual stabilization of climate, the pace of ecological renewal, and the rhythms of life returning to balance. It is as though the Earth itself kept a journal, line by line, of the sea's second birth. Life, which had been scattered or extinguished during the desiccation, surged back with vigour. Marine ecosystems, once limited to isolated pockets of survival, now exploded into diversity. Shoals of sardines and anchovies darted in the shallows, while larger predators, sharks, dolphins, and ancient whales, followed in pursuit. Coral reefs spread along rocky outcrops, anchoring themselves to limestone cliffs that had once towered over salt deserts. In the depths, abyssal communities colonized new terrain, building webs of life on sediments that had only recently been exposed to air. The Mediterranean had become a theatre of recolonization, a canvas where evolution painted swiftly with broad strokes. On land, the changes were equally profound. The return of a full sea altered weather patterns across two continents. Rainfall increased, feeding rivers and filling lakes that had dwindled during the Messinian Salinity Crisis. Valleys in Spain, Italy and Greece bloomed with new vegetation, their soils enriched by sediments left behind during desiccation. Forests thickened in southern Europe, attracting deer, wild boar and other herbivores that flourished in the renewed greenery. Predators, from big cats to early canids, followed in their wake. The rhythm of migration shifted again, this time in response to abundance rather than scarcity. But abundance carried its own risks. The Mediterranean, young once more, was a restless sea. Its coastlines were unstable, its sediments loose, and its currents fierce. Tsunamis may have continued to ripple outward for centuries after the flood, triggered by submarine landslides along steep canyon walls. Volcanic activity in the Aegean and southern Italy added another layer of volatility. The sea was alive with possibility, but it was also alive with danger. For millions of years after the flood, the Mediterranean continued to act as a climate engine, shaping rainfall and vegetation across the surrounding continents. North Africa, though destined to become dominated by the Sahara Desert, enjoyed intervals of relative greenness when rains supported grasslands and even lakes across what is now barren sand. Europe experienced alternating periods of warmth and cooling, its ecosystems responding to shifts in the currents that coursed through the Mediterranean. The rebirth of the sea was not a return to permanence but to rhythm, a cycle of abundance and scarcity that would define the landscapes of two continents. In this reborn world, evolution marched on. Fossil evidence shows that many lineages of animals adapted rapidly to the new conditions. Some species that had crossed into Europe during the Messinian Crisis now found themselves stranded as the sea once again became a barrier. Others, like marine mammals, flourished in the renewed habitat, diversifying into forms that would dominate the Mediterranean for millennia. Insects, plants, and birds adapted to new coastlines, weaving themselves into ecosystems that had to be rebuilt almost from scratch. The Mediterranean became a laboratory of evolution, shaped by its dramatic past. Humans, though far in the future, would inherit this laboratory. The Mediterranean's rebirth set the stage for the rise of civilizations that depended on its resources. Fish stocks supported early coastal settlements. Fertile valleys nurtured the spread of agriculture. Islands and peninsulas became stepping stones for trade and exploration. The sea that had once vanished would become the sea that bound empires together. From the Phoenicians to the Greeks, from Rome to Byzantium, its presence would define the human story as profoundly as its absence had defined the geological one. Still, the ghost of the Messinian Crisis remained, buried beneath waves. The salt deposits that formed during the desiccation lay hidden beneath sediments, but they shaped the geology of the region. Over time, the weight of sediments caused these salts to flow, creating domes and ridges that warped the seafloor. These structures became traps for oil and gas, reservoirs of energy that humans would one day tap, unaware that their origins lay in a vanished sea. Even today, seismic surveys reveal the extent of these hidden salt mountains, stretching for miles beneath the modern Mediterranean, silent reminders of an ancient desert. To stand at the cliffs of Gibraltar today, watching the steady exchange of waters between the Atlantic and Mediterranean, is to look upon a doorway that once opened with apocalyptic force. The strait now appears eternal, yet its history tells another story, that it can close, and it can open, and the fate of seas depends on such fragile thresholds. The rebirth of the Mediterranean is a testament to the power of renewal, but also to the impermanence of stability, and so the sea endured, transformed from desert to ocean, from silence to abundance. But its story did not end with the flood. The Mediterranean would continue to shift, to test the balance between land and water, between stability and change. It would witness the rise of empires, the fall of civilizations, and the endless dance of climate and tectonics. Its present beauty conceals a past of violence, and its future, like its past, remains uncertain. For beneath the surface, the earth never sleeps. The plates continue their slow collision, the crust continues to fracture, and the balance of waters remains fragile. What was once lost could vanish again, for nothing in Earth's story is permanent. The Mediterranean, reborn, carries in its depth the echo of its own disappearance, a reminder that seas can die and seas can return. And as the waves lap against the shores of continents, one cannot help but wonder, is this sea truly eternal, or only living on borrowed time? The Mediterranean, newly reborn after the cataclysm of the Zanclean flood, was more than just a sea restored. It was a reordering of Earth's balance. Yet to see it as merely an ending would miss its deeper resonance. What followed was a long silence, not of absence but of transformation, as the waters settled into their basin and life reshaped itself upon the ruins of a vanished desert. The Mediterranean had returned, but the traces of what had been lost were never erased. They lingered in hidden canyons, in buried salt, in the altered trajectories of climates and species. In its earlier centuries, the restored sea was restless. Its waters surged violently against new coastlines, eroding cliffs that had been exposed to air for millions of years. Entire escarpments collapsed into the waves, sending tsunamis across the basin. Landslides triggered by destabilized sediments created underwater avalanches, turbidity currents that raced through the depths, leaving behind massive deposits of sand and silt. These scars, invisible to the naked eye today, can still be traced by seismic surveys, proof of the turbulence that followed rebirth. It was a world learning how to be a sea again. Currents soon established themselves, swirling with a vigour sharpened by the shape of the basin. The inflow from Gibraltar and the outflow of surface water created gyres that carried nutrients across vast distances. These currents became the arteries of renewal, distributing oxygen, minerals, and life. The Mediterranean began to stabilise, but not in uniformity. Its eastern and western basins evolved differently, divided by underwater ridges that directed the flow. In some areas, deep water stagnated, becoming anoxic, hostile to most creatures yet nurturing microbial communities adapted to oxygen-starved darkness. In others, upwelling currents brought nutrients to the surface, fueling explosions of plankton that drew shoals of fish and whales. The ecological rebirth was both sudden and gradual. Marine mammals, long absent, returned with vigour, reclaiming the waters with songs and migrations. Fish species from the Atlantic colonised the basin, but many adapted to its unique salinity and temperature, diverging into new forms. Coral reefs took root, fragile yet resilient, building intricate structures that sheltered countless organisms. For every species that vanished in the Messinian Crisis, new ones found opportunities in the restored sea. Evolution was writing quickly, using catastrophe as ink, and on land, the return of the sea transformed climates and ecosystems. Rainfall increased across southern Europe and North Africa, stabilizing rivers that had once cut desperate gorges into stone. Valleys became fertile again, their soils enriched by ancient sediments exposed during desiccation. Grasslands gave way to forests and lakes spread across lowlands. Animal migration shifted once more, but now with gentler rhythms. The corridors that had once connected Africa and Europe disappeared beneath the waves, isolating populations on either side. Evolution, once driven by bridges, was now guided by barriers. The Mediterranean had become once more a boundary and a crossroads. For species trapped on islands formed by drowned mountain ridges, isolation gave rise to unique evolutionary experiments. Fossils revealed dwarf elephants and giant rodents, creatures shaped by the constraints of island life. On Sardinia, Sicily and Crete, ecosystems unfolded like miniature worlds, their inhabitants both familiar and strange. The sea that had once united continents now divided them, and in the spaces between division and connection, new life emerged. But even in this renewal, the scars of the past were never far away. Deep below, the salt deposits from the Messinian Crisis shifted slowly under pressure, warping sediments and shaping the seafloor. In some places, these salt layers rose in pillars known as diapirs, piercing younger sediments and creating geological traps that would one day hold oil and gas. These invisible structures were reminders of a vanished desert, their presence proof that the Mediterranean had once been a place of silence and heat, rather than waves and storms. The climate, though stabilized, bore long echoes of the vanished sea. Dust storms diminished, but traces of salt still lingered in soils across Europe and Africa. The Sahara, though still arid, paused in its expansion, its climate moderated by the presence of the restored sea. Yet the balance was delicate. The Mediterranean was smaller and more enclosed than the great oceans, and its dependence on Atlantic inflow made it perpetually fragile. Even in its rebirth, it remained a sea on borrowed time, living in the tension between evaporation and replenishment. For geologists today, the Zanclean flood and the rebirth of the Mediterranean are among the most dramatic stories Earth has ever written. Seismic profiles, drill cores and fossils reveal the before and after, the salt plains and desiccated valleys replaced by sediments of a thriving marine ecosystem. Each layer of rock tells a story of transformation, of catastrophe turned to creation. But for those who imagine standing at the edge of the flood, the story is not about layers of stone, but about awe. To watch the ocean fall into a desert, to see rivers drowned in days, to hear the thunder of water echoing across continents. That was an event beyond comprehension, yet real, written forever into the earth. The Mediterranean as we know it was born from that violence. Its coastlines, islands and currents all carry the fingerprints of disappearance and return. And yet, for all its beauty, its story is unfinished. The plates still move, Africa still presses north, and the Strait of Gibraltar remains the narrowest of thresholds. In geological time, nothing is permanent. The sea could vanish again, sealed off by uplift or altered by climate. The echoes of the Messinian Crisis are not just relics of the past, they are warnings for the future. To stand today on the shores of Sicily, Spain or Morocco is to look out over a sea that seems eternal, but beneath its surface lies a truth more fragile. It is a sea reborn from catastrophe, resting on the bones of a desert, kept alive by the patience of an ocean just beyond Gibraltar. Its waves are both present and past, both abundance and absence. And if Earth's story teaches anything, it is that no sea, however vast, is beyond the reach of change. And so the Mediterranean endured, reborn, abundant, restless, yet forever marked by the silence that once defined it. But its legacy would not be confined to geology alone. The sea that had vanished would one day cradle the rise of human civilizations, becoming the stage upon which empires dreamed, fought, and fell. The memory of its absence hidden beneath waves would whisper to future generations in myths of floods and vanished worlds. And the question would remain, what does it mean for a sea to disappear, and what truths does its return leave behind? Long after the flood had roared through Gibraltar and drowned the silence of the desert, the Mediterranean settled into a rhythm that would shape the fate of continents. Its waters shimmered with new life, its currents breathed stability into climates, and its coastlines hardened into forms that would endure for millions of years. Yet the echoes of its disappearance continued to ripple through time, etched into the very bones of the land. The reborn sea was not a blank slate, but a palimpsest, a page overwritten but still bearing traces of the words before. In the centuries following the Zanclin flood, the Mediterranean's surface may have appeared tranquil, but beneath the waves it was alive with turbulence. As water cascaded into drowned canyons, sediment swirled in clouds, settling in layers that buried salt plains and fossilized riverbeds. Turbidity currents, dense avalanches of mud and sand swept down submarine slopes, filling the deepest trenches with debris. These deposits became silent witnesses, preserving fragments of organisms swept into the flood, leaves carried by rivers, and bones of animals caught in the deluge. For geologists today, these layers tell the story of recovery with the intimacy of a diary, each grain a memory of violence and renewal. Life responded with astonishing speed. Within mere centuries, the basin teemed with shoals of fish that had migrated from the Atlantic. Dolphins returned, weaving arcs of silver through the waves. Whales followed, their songs reverberating in the deep where silence had once ruled. Microscopic plankton bloomed in great swirls, staining the sea green and fueling entire food webs. Coral reefs began to grow along the rugged coastlines, fragile fortresses where biodiversity flourished. The Mediterranean became once more a sea of abundance, a sanctuary of life that had been absent for millions of years, yet abundance was never uniform. The sea, though filled, carried traces of its violent rebirth. Brine pools remained in the deepest depressions, lakes of hypersaline water heavier than the ocean above, lying like traps in the abyss. These pools killed most life that strayed into them, yet nurtured extremophiles, microbes that thrived in their toxic chemistry. Even in the age of renewal, these dark oases carried echoes of the Messinian desert, tiny memorials to the sea's former absence. On the continents that bordered the basin, the return of the sea reshaped ecosystems. Rainfall patterns shifted once more, forests spread across valleys in Europe, and grasslands stretched across North Africa. Rivers stabilized, carrying nutrients that nourished fertile plains. Animals returned to migration routes reshaped by the sea's boundaries, some now cut off from corridors they had once travelled freely. Evolution worked in these new conditions, sculpting species that adapted to isolation, abundance, or confinement. Fossil records show unique island faunas arising where mountains had become islands. Dwarf elephants, giant rodents, strange birds, all products of the Mediterranean's transformation into a mosaic of boundaries and opportunities. For early primates in Africa, these climatic shifts may have shaped environments that would one day influence human evolution. Expanding grasslands, interspersed with forests and water sources, offered both challenges and opportunities. Though separated by millions of years from the rise of Homo sapiens, the echoes of the Messinian Crisis reached into the future, contributing to the environmental pressures that guided the path toward humanity. The disappearance of the Mediterranean was not just a local event, but part of a larger narrative of planetary change. Its ripples carried far beyond its shores. The geology of the basin carried reminders too. Buried beneath thick sediments, the salt mountains formed during the Messinian Salinity Crisis shifted slowly, flowing under pressure like plastic. They rose into domes, warped overlying layers, and created voids that would one day become reservoirs of oil and gas. These subterranean movements continue to shape the seafloor, affecting tectonics and even triggering earthquakes. The Mediterranean was not simply a placid sea, but a restless one, its foundations alive with the memory of its absence. And still, Gibraltar remained a threshold. Today, the strait appears permanent, a narrow channel where tides surge endlessly between Atlantic and Mediterranean. But its history reminds us that permanence is an illusion. The plates still move, Africa still presses north, and the threshold could close again in some distant future. If that day comes, the Mediterranean may once again face desiccation, its waters retreating, its salt rising, its silence returning. The Messinian Crisis is not locked in the past. It is part of a cycle that could repeat. For ancient myths, these echoes of catastrophe may have lived on as whispers. Later civilizations that flourished along Mediterranean shores would tell stories of great floods and vanished worlds. In Mesopotamia, Greece and beyond, tales of waters rising to drown lands carried a resonance that may have been inspired, however faintly, by landscapes scarred by ancient crises. Though no humans witnessed the Zanclean flood, its memory survived in stone, and stone became the canvas upon which myths were drawn. To imagine standing on the cliffs of Crete or Sicily in those first centuries after the flood is to picture a horizon utterly transformed. Where once salt plains shimmered white beneath a merciless sun, waves now sparkled in infinite blue. The roar of waterfalls had quieted, leaving behind the steady rhythm of tides. Birds soared over new coastlines, their cries mingling with the crash of surf. In the depths, drowned canyons teemed with life once more, as if the earth itself had taken a breath after holding it for too long. The Mediterranean's rebirth was not the end of its story, but the beginning of a new chapter. Its currents, climates, and coastlines would shape the rise of civilizations, the patterns of trade, the spread of cultures. Its beauty would inspire poets, its abundance would feed empires, its narrow straits would become contested corridors of power. And always, beneath the waves, it would carry the memory of a desert, a silence, a vanished world. The lesson of the Messinian Crisis is not only that seas can vanish, but that their absence changes everything. It alters climates, redirects evolution, and rewrites the paths of history. To understand the Mediterranean is to see not just its present, but the ghost of its past, the desert beneath the water, the silence beneath the waves. And as the sea shimmered under the sun in its renewed form, the question lingered in the air, unspoken yet undeniable. How long can such abundance endure before the earth reminds us, once again, of the fragility of oceans? The Mediterranean, once emptied and filled again in cataclysm, entered the quiet expanse of time that followed. Yet the silence was deceptive. Beneath its blue surface, the scars of the Messinian Crisis continued to dictate the character of the sea. It was no ordinary ocean. It was a survivor, its very foundation built upon the memory of its absence. The salt deposits buried deep below remained as restless monuments, shifting and deforming, shaping the sea floor like the hidden bones of a vanished creature. To swim above those waters was to drift unknowingly over an ancient desert entombed in stone. Over the course of millions of years, the Mediterranean became a sea defined by paradox. Its vast surface suggested permanence, yet its very survival was precarious. Unlike the great oceans of the world, the Mediterranean lost more water each year to evaporation than it gained from rivers. Only the constant inflow from the Atlantic through Gibraltar kept it alive. Without that lifeline, it would once again wither under the sun, repeating the same story that had played out during the Messinian epoch. The sea's existence was not a guarantee, but a balance, delicate as glass. This fragility made the Mediterranean a place of extremes. During warm periods, evaporation intensified, concentrating salt in its waters and stressing marine ecosystems. During cooler glacial periods, when ice sheets spread across Europe, the Mediterranean's level fell, exposing coastlines and connecting islands to the mainland. Each fluctuation redrew the map of the basin, creating and erasing land bridges that reshaped the migration of animals and eventually humans. The rebirth of the sea had not ended change, it had only set the stage for new transformations. Island life became one of the most vivid testaments to these cycles. Mountains once stranded by the flood became isolated worlds surrounded by sea. On these islands, evolution took strange and beautiful paths. Fossils revealed dwarf elephants on Sicily and Malta, their massive bodies reduced to adapt to limited resources. Giant rodents and outsized birds roamed landscapes that existed nowhere else. These miniature worlds were laboratories of survival, experiments written in bone and feather, reminders that isolation can both nurture diversity and doom it when conditions shift again. The Mediterranean's ecological richness was matched by its geological volatility. The collision of the African and Eurasian plates continued to fold and fracture the crust, giving rise to earthquakes and volcanoes. The Aegean archipelago, with its scattering of islands, was born of this tectonic violence, as was Mount Etna in Sicily, which still roars to life with fire that echoes the restless forces beneath. Submarine landslides triggered by shifting sediments occasionally sent tsunamis racing across the basin. To live near the Mediterranean, in any epoch, was to live beside beauty and danger, to exist on a threshold between calm and catastrophe. Climate was equally bound to the sea's fate. Its waters regulated temperatures across southern Europe, North Africa, and the Levant, moderating winters and fueling storms. Dust from the Sahara blew northward, feeding nutrients into the sea, fertilizing plankton blooms that sustained fish stocks. The balance between land and water became a dialogue that shaped the environment far beyond the basin itself. In wetter intervals, grasslands flourished across North Africa, and rivers carved their way into the desert. In drier ones, sands reclaimed the land, and the Sahara spread its influence. The Mediterranean was not merely a body of water but a climate engine, a pulse that influenced half a continent. The memory of its disappearance remained hidden in geological archives. Deep beneath the seabed, the salt layers from the Messinian Crisis warped under pressure, creating vast domes that pressed upward. These structures, invisible from above, became important in ways no creature of that time could imagine. They trapped hydrocarbons, forming reservoirs of oil and gas that humans would one day discover and exploit. They shifted the stability of slopes, sometimes collapsing and triggering submarine landslides. They were silent yet active, reminders that the vanished sea had not gone quietly, but continued to shape the present. Life thrived in the renewed sea, yet always under the shadow of its instability. The Mediterranean remained more saline than the Atlantic, its waters heavier, its deep layers often starved of oxygen. In these dark depths, unique communities adapted, feeding not on sunlight, but on chemical reactions, forming ecosystems that echoed the extremophils of the Messinian desert lakes. Life had not only rebounded, it had found ways to echo its own past, as if the crisis had left behind a genetic and ecological memory. And always, the Mediterranean remained a threshold, a meeting place. Its currents carried species between continents, while its barriers preserved diversity in isolation. For birds, it was a highway of migration, connecting Africa to Europe each year. For fish and mammals, it was both refuge and challenge, a sea of abundance that could also trap species in its saline confines. The patterns established in the wake of the flood would ripple through millions of years, preparing the stage for the arrival of humans, whose destiny would be bound to these waters. To imagine the Mediterranean during this long, quiet epoch is to picture a sea shimmering with life yet haunted by memory. Beneath its waves lay drowned canyons, vast scars filled with sediments. Along its shores rose cliffs that once overlooked deserts, now softened by waves. On its islands, strange creatures evolved in isolation, their lives unfolding in worlds that vanished as quickly as they appeared. And all the while, the Earth's plates pressed onward, slowly tightening the basin, ensuring that change was never complete, never final. This was a sea caught between survival and disappearance, balance and collapse. It was fragile yet resilient, abundant yet precarious, a paradox as vast as the continents that enclosed it. And as the waves lapped against its coasts, the question always lingered in the silence beneath. Could such a sea endure forever, or was it only living in the pause between vanishing and return? The story of the Mediterranean's rebirth, then, was not merely about water filling a desert. It was about fragility hidden beneath beauty, about the restless forces that can erase even oceans, about the impermanence of what seems eternal. The Messinian Crisis had ended, but its shadow stretched across time, reminding the world that seas are never guaranteed. And as the Mediterranean settled into its new rhythm, it did so with the faint whisper of salt still lingering in its depths, a ghostly reminder that nothing, not even the sea, is beyond loss. As the Mediterranean continued its long post-flood journey, it became a paradoxical sea, both renewed and ancient, both stable and precarious. Millions of years had passed since the Zanclean flood thundered through Gibraltar, yet the basin never truly escaped its memory. Beneath the glittering surface of turquoise bays and endless horizons lay the fingerprints of a desert, encoded in salt, sediment, and stone. To study the Mediterranean was to uncover a sea that remembered its own disappearance, a sea that carried the fragility of all oceans within its depths. The land around the basin bore the legacy as well. Southern Europe, North Africa, and the Levant were shaped not only by the presence of the sea, but also by its earlier absence. Fertile soils created by desiccation fed the regrowth of forests and grasslands. Valleys once carved by rivers plunging into a vanished abyss became filled with sediments, transforming into plains rich with nutrients. Even the islands scattered across the sea told the tale of instability. Sardinia, Crete, and Cyprus, rising as fragments of drowned mountain ridges, became laboratories of life where evolution experimented in miniature. Here, dwarf elephants, giant rodents, and other strange forms emerged, adaptations to environments that were at once isolated and fragile. The Mediterranean's influence on climate was profound. Its restored waters stabilized rainfall patterns that extended deep into the continents. Storms born over its surface brought moisture to Europe, fueling rivers and nourishing forests. In North Africa, the sea's presence tempered extremes, at times allowing savannas to stretch where deserts now reign. Yet the balance was delicate. The Mediterranean's shallow connection to the Atlantic made it vulnerable to fluctuations in global climate. During ice ages, when sea levels fell, Gibraltar's strait narrowed, and the Mediterranean's water levels dropped, exposing coastlines and reconnecting land corridors. During warm interglacial periods, the sea swelled, drowning valleys and reshaping habitats once again. This cycle of exposure and inundation shaped not only animals, but the future paths of humanity. For early humans migrating out of Africa, the Mediterranean was both a barrier and a bridge. At times, lowered sea levels revealed stepping stones of land across what are now straits. At other times, the sea swelled, forcing migrations to bend around its coasts. Archaeological evidence suggests that hominins may have reached islands earlier than once believed, perhaps carried accidentally by rafts of vegetation or daring to cross narrow straits. In this way, the Mediterranean played its part in human prehistory long before civilizations arose along its shores. The sea's restless geology mirrored its fragile ecology. The African and Eurasian plates continued their collision, a slow embrace that gave rise to mountains and deep trenches alike. In the Aegean, islands shifted and multiplied as the crust fractured. In southern Italy, Mount Etna rumbled, fed by forces rooted deep in the earth. Submarine landslides triggered by shifting salt deposits and sediment buildup sometimes sent tsunamis racing across the basin. To live in the shadow of the Mediterranean was to live with beauty that could turn to violence in an instant, and yet in that instability lay opportunity. The same tectonic forces that created earthquakes and volcanoes also forged fertile valleys and rich coastal plains. Volcanic ash nourished soils, supporting agriculture when humans eventually arrived. Earthquakes reshaped rivers, creating new wetlands where birds and fish thrived. Even the salt deposits buried beneath the basin played their part. They warped and shifted, creating domes that became traps for oil and gas, resources that humans would one day exploit, never realizing they were gifts of a vanished desert. Beneath the sea, life adapted to the rhythms of instability. In the deep, oxygen-poor waters, unique ecosystems thrived without sunlight, relying on chemical reactions for survival. These communities mirrored, in their own way, the extremophiles of the Messinian desert, a continuity of life adapting to extremes. On the surface, plankton blooms fed shoals of fish that drew predators in vast migrations. The Mediterranean became a sea of abundance, yet always tinged with the knowledge that its abundance was conditional, sustained only by the constant inflow from the Atlantic. That inflow itself became part of the story. The waters of Gibraltar acted like a vein carrying lifeblood into the Mediterranean. Warm, salty water flowed out at the surface, while cooler, denser Atlantic water rushed in at depth, balancing the sea's deficit. This exchange created complex currents that shaped ecosystems and weather alike. Without it, the Mediterranean would once again be doomed to desiccation. To this day, scientists monitor the strait closely, knowing that its narrow width is both lifeline and vulnerability, a reminder of the catastrophe that once unfolded there. Even myths would one day echo the memory of the vanished sea, civilizations rising along its shores. Greeks, Egyptians, Phoenicians told stories of floods, vanished lands and seas that returned with fury. These myths, though born in human time, resonated with landscapes scarred by events far older. Perhaps the memory of drowned valleys and strange fossils found in mountain cliffs fed the imagination of storytellers who turned geological catastrophe into tales of gods and punishment. The Mediterranean's crisis, though long past, may have whispered into the mythology of cultures that came much later. To imagine the Mediterranean in this long epoch after its rebirth is to see a sea alive with contradictions. It sparkled with beauty, yet beneath it lay the weight of buried deserts. It fed forests and rivers, yet always teetered on the edge of imbalance. It nurtured strange life on its islands, yet destroyed with earthquakes and floods. It was both cradle and grave, both giver and taker, a mirror of the earth's restless heart. Standing on the shore of this renewed sea, one might have been lulled into believing it eternal. Waves lapped gently, fish had darted in the shallows, birds wheeled overhead, and the horizon shimmered in unbroken blue. But deep below, the salt deposits shifted, the crust groaned, and the memory of silence endured. The Mediterranean was not simply a sea. It was a paradox suspended in time, a reminder that even oceans can vanish, and so the sea lived on, fragile and magnificent, carrying within it the shadow of a desert and the promise of abundance. It was a balance that would shape not only the natural world, but also the destiny of human civilizations yet to come. For one day, people would gather on these shores, sail across these waters, and build their empires around this sea of memory. And when they did, they would inherit not just the abundance of the Mediterranean, but also its fragility, its warnings, and its restless heart. The Mediterranean, in the wake of its cataclysm, carried within it both renewal and unrest. To gaze upon its calm surface millions of years after the Zanclean flood was to see only beauty, sunlight scattering across waves, islands rising like green jewels, and currents moving with hypnotic rhythm. But beneath this serenity, the sea remained a restless witness to its own past. It was no ordinary body of water. It was a survivor of death and resurrection, a sea that had vanished and returned, carrying in its depth the memory of silence. The cycles of climate continued to play their role in shaping this fragile equilibrium. During cooler epochs, ice expanded across the northern hemisphere, trapping water in glaciers and lowering sea levels worldwide. The Mediterranean, shallow compared to the great oceans, felt these changes with brutal immediacy. Coasts retreated, islands merged with the mainland, and new land bridges appeared between Europe, Africa, and Asia. These bridges allowed waves of animals to move freely, crossing boundaries that had once separated them. Fossils reveal elephants and hippos roaming across what would later be seabeds, their tracks erased by tides when sea levels rose again. The Mediterranean became not only a sea but a stage upon which the drama of migration and adaptation unfolded endlessly. When the climate warmed, the sea swelled again, drowning lowlands and reshaping coastlines. Valleys became fjords, mountains became islands, and forests gave way to wetlands. For creatures adapted to stability, these cycles were merciless. Populations fragmented, some driven into extinction, others forced to evolve new strategies. On islands, the results were dramatic. Dwarf elephants shrinking to survive on meagre resources, giant rodents flourishing without predators, and birds becoming flightless in the absence of danger. The Mediterranean was a factory of uniqueness, an evolutionary crucible made possible by instability itself. Geologically, the basin remained alive with tension. Africa's slow but relentless push northward continued to fold and fracture the crust, creating earthquakes that rattled coastlines and volcanic eruptions that lit the sky with fire. The Aegean island shifted and multiplied as the crust stretched and tore. Etna and Vesuvius, still young in geological terms, grew from deep volcanic roots into mountains that dominated the horizon. These volcanoes, fed by forces far beneath the seabed, stood as reminders that the Mediterranean's calm was never permanent. One eruption could darken skies for months, choke valleys with ash, and send waves surging outward in destructive fury. Beneath the waves, the sea's foundations were equally unstable. The vast salt deposits from the Messinian Salinity Crisis did not lie quietly. Pressed by the weight of sediments, they flowed slowly upward, warping layers into domes and ridges. These hidden structures shaped the sea floor, directing currents, triggering submarine landslides, and creating voids that could collapse without warning. In some places, they trapped oil and gas, energy stores that would remain untouched for millions of years, awaiting the hands of a species not yet born. To the creatures of the time, these hidden movements were invisible. To the earth itself, they were a reminder that memory is never still. It presses upward, distorting the present with the weight of the past. The ecosystems of the Mediterranean grew in both richness and vulnerability. The shallow coastal zones became nurseries for fish and invertebrates, while deeper waters hosted whales and sharks. Coral reefs, fragile yet resilient, expanded along rocky shores, forming labyrinths of biodiversity. Migratory birds crossed its expanse annually, using its islands as stepping stones between continents. Yet this abundance was constantly tested by salinity, temperature shifts, and changes in sea level. The Mediterranean was never a stable Eden. It was a place of thresholds, where survival depended on adaptability. The Sahara, looming to the south, influenced the sea as much as the sea influenced it. Winds carried dust northward, scattering nutrients that fertilize plankton blooms in the water. In wetter intervals, rivers flowed from the Sahara into the sea, carrying life into regions that are now barren desert. At other times, drought gripped the land, and sand swallowed valleys that had once been green. The dialogue between sea and desert shaped not only ecosystems, but also the possibilities of future human life. The Mediterranean was not just a sea confined by mountains. It was a hinge between climates, a pivot of Earth's rhythms. To imagine standing on its shore during these ages is to witness change compressed into endless repetition. The horizon might appear eternal, yet coastlines shifted within lifetimes. A valley once filled with forests could drown in decades as waters rose. An island's unique fauna might vanish in a single catastrophic flood. The sea was both a cradle and a destroyer, a reminder that abundance and loss are inseparable. And as time marched forward, the Mediterranean's importance grew not only in geology and ecology, but in destiny. The rhythms it created shaped conditions far beyond its basin. Europe's forests and grasslands, Africa's deserts and savannas, Asia's river valleys, all were influenced by the presence of this sea. Its currents and storms carried energy across continents, while its boundaries guided the migrations of life. Even before humanity appeared, the Mediterranean was a force of connection, a stage that determined the paths of survival. When the first ancestors of humankind began their journey across Africa, the Mediterranean already stood as both barrier and invitation. Its shimmering expanse marked the edge of the known, while its islands and narrowing straits hinted at passage. The sea had vanished and returned once before. To these early beings it was eternal, but the earth carried the memory of fragility within it. The Messinian Crisis was not forgotten by stone, even if no eyes remained to see it. And so the Mediterranean endured, a paradox alive in every wave. It was abundance built on scarcity, stability built on fracture, beauty built on the bones of catastrophe. Each tide carried whispers of salt deserts long buried. Each current flowed over drowned canyons carved in silence. To know the Mediterranean was to see both presence and absence, both life and its vanishing. The question lingered, unspoken but undeniable. Was this sea reborn forever, or only for now? Would tectonics one day close Gibraltar again, sealing the basin from the Atlantic? Would climate, in some far future, drain its waters once more, leaving behind another desert of salt? The earth does not grant permanence, it grants cycles, and the Mediterranean, with its vanished past buried deep below, carried in its depths the certainty that even seas can die. In its waves shimmered both promise and warning, both cradle and grave, and as the basin settled into its rhythm, the stage was set for the arrival of a species that would one day call its shores home, build cities upon its coasts, and write myths upon its waters, never fully knowing that beneath their feet lay the silence of a vanished sea. The Mediterranean in the deep time after its rebirth became a sea not just of water, but of memory. Its surface glittered with waves like any other, yet every current, every shoreline, every island carried the imprint of the cataclysm that had once remade it. Beneath its calm exterior lay a truth written in salt and sediment, that this sea was fragile, that it had died before, and that it could die again. For millions of years after the Zanclean flood, the Mediterranean balanced between stability and risk, a balance that would come to shape the destiny of both nature and humanity. The rhythms of Earth's climate continued their endless cycle. Ice ages came and went, lowering sea levels and exposing land where water had once ruled. In these times the Mediterranean shrank, its coasts retreating, its islands swelling into peninsulas. Valleys carved by ancient rivers re-emerged, if only briefly, as green corridors or dusty plains. When the ice melted, the sea returned, filling those valleys again, drowning the lowlands, cutting islands off once more. Each cycle redrew the map, forcing life to adjust again and again. The Mediterranean was less a fixed landscape than a shifting mosaic, its boundaries in constant negotiation with the sky. This instability drove evolution in strange directions. On islands, species bent themselves to isolation. Fossils reveal elephants no taller than horses, adapted to scarce resources. Birds lost their ability to fly, evolving into heavy, ground-dwelling forms that thrived until the seas shifted again. Rodents grew to unusual sizes, ruling tiny ecosystems like giants in miniature worlds. Each extinction, each adaptation, was a response to the sea's changing rhythms. The Mediterranean was an evolutionary crucible, forging uniqueness in places that would later be lost when waters returned. Geology never ceased its work. The African plate pressed northward into Eurasia, compressing the basin with relentless force. Mountains rose, Alps, Pyrenees, Apennines, while earthquakes fractured coastlines. The Aegean islands splintered into archipelagos, born from tension beneath the crust. Volcanoes roared to life, fed by this same collision. Vesuvius, Stromboli, Etna, mountains of fire that still breathe today, were children of the Mediterranean's restless geology, reminders that creation and destruction were inseparable here. Even the seafloor trembled, destabilized by buried salt layers that crept upward like ghosts, warping sediments, triggering landslides that sent tsunamis surging across the basin. For animals and plants, this volatility was both gift and danger. Rivers poured nutrients into the sea, feeding plankton blooms that sustained fish in endless abundance. Migratory birds crossed its waters in great arcs, using islands as stepping stones. Whales sang in its depths, their voices echoing through drowned canyons carved long ago by vanished rivers. Yet every gift carried risk. An earthquake could collapse coastlines, a volcanic eruption could choke skies with ash. A tsunami could erase entire coastal ecosystems in hours. To live near the Mediterranean was to live in a balance between fertility and catastrophe. The Sahara Desert, sprawling to the south, remained an ever-present partner in this story. Winds carried its dust northward, scattering it into the sea, fertilizing its waters with nutrients that sustained life. In wetter intervals, rivers carved across the Sahara, feeding fresh water into the Mediterranean, creating green corridors that linked Africa to Europe. In drier times, the desert advanced, choking life and sending animals and people searching for refuge along the coasts. This dialogue between desert and sea shaped not only ecosystems but the fate of species. The Mediterranean was more than a basin of water. It was a hinge between two extremes, between abundance and desolation. For humanity's ancestors, the Mediterranean became both obstacle and invitation. As early hominins spread from Africa into Eurasia, they encountered the sea's shifting moods. At times of low sea level, straits narrowed or vanished, creating bridges of land that allowed passage into Europe. At other times, rising seas forced migrations to bend along its coasts, driving innovation in tools and navigation. Archaeological discoveries suggest that even before modern humans, early hominins may have crossed narrow channels, perhaps carried by rafts of vegetation or primitive vessels. The Mediterranean was already shaping the human story, long before civilizations rose upon its shores. Its volatility found echoes in human imagination. Myths of floods, of vanished lands, of seas created or destroyed by the gods, would later spring from cultures that lived along its edges. The Greek tale of Atlantis, the biblical flood, the Mesopotamian epic of Gilgamesh, though born in different regions, all carried echoes of catastrophes older than memory. Perhaps these stories were nourished by the landscapes themselves. Fossils of sea creatures found high in mountains, cliffs etched with strange scars, and valleys drowned long ago. The earth had written its past in stone, and humans read it as myth. Even as time moved toward the age of civilization, the Mediterranean remained fragile. Its survival still depended on the inflow from the Atlantic through Gibraltar, a strait so narrow it seemed impossible that it could sustain an entire sea. Yet it did, balancing evaporation with replenishment, maintaining the sea as a living, breathing system. Scientists today know that if Gibraltar were ever to close again, through tectonic uplift or human intervention, the Mediterranean would begin to shrink within centuries, repeating the cycle of desiccation. The Messinian Salinity Crisis was not a singular event. It was a possibility always waiting beneath the surface. To imagine the Mediterranean at this stage in its long history is to see a paradox of beauty and fragility. Its waters shimmered blue beneath the sun, islands dotted its horizon, and life thrived in abundance. Yet beneath those waves lay mountains of salt, warped sediments, restless faults, and drowned canyons, a silent reminder of how easily it could vanish. It was a sea alive with contradiction, eternal in appearance, impermanent in truth. And as the cycles of climate, tectonics, and life continued, the Mediterranean prepared itself for its next role, not just as a sea shaping animals and plants, but as a cradle for human civilization. Its shores would one day host cities and empires, its islands would become crossroads of trade, its waters the setting for both myths and history. The vanished sea of the Messinian would become the reborn sea of culture and conquest. But in the depths, in the silence where salt layers still shifted, the memory of absence endured. The Mediterranean was a survivor of death, but survival is never eternal. And so, as waves lapped against its coasts and winds whispered across its surface, the question pressed itself into the future. Could even this sea, so central to life and history, remain forever? Or was it only a pause between vanishing and return? The Mediterranean's rebirth, though it restored blue horizons and thriving ecosystems, was never an erasure of what had come before. Beneath the rolling surface, beneath the shoals of fish and the migrating whales, the bones of the vanished sea remained. Salt mountains stretched across the basin like buried ghosts, warped and folded under the pressure of time. Drowned canyons slumbered in darkness, their cliffs carved by rivers that no longer roared. To drift across the Mediterranean in this age was to glide over a graveyard, where every wave was both a symbol of abundance and a veil hiding the memory of absence. Earth's cycles continued their steady beat, and with each ice age the Mediterranean was reshaped. During glacial maxima, sea levels dropped by more than 100 metres. Shores extended outward, exposing plains where dolphins had once swum. Islands joined to the mainland, opening paths for animals and, later, humans. When the glaciers melted, the sea returned, reclaiming its lost ground with relentless patience. These oscillations, repeating for hundreds of thousands of years, ensured that the Mediterranean was never fixed. It was a shifting theatre, always rehearsing different roles, always demanding that life adapt or vanish. The creatures that lived along its margins bore witness to this restlessness. Herds of mammoths, elephants, and hippos once roamed its coasts during low seas, grazing on fertile plains that now see floor. Predators stalked them, lions, hyenas, and early wolves, shaping ecosystems that pulsed with energy. When the sea returned, these animals retreated, leaving behind fossils embedded in cliffs and caves that would one day intrigue human eyes. On islands, isolation forced dramatic changes. Dwarf elephants no higher than a man's chest, giant swans unable to fly, and oversized rodents thrived in habitats cut off from the mainland. Each species was a fleeting experiment, a response to the whims of the sea's expansion and retreat. Beneath the surface, the Mediterranean remained a paradoxical sea. Its waters were saltier than the Atlantic, heavier, prone to stagnation in the deepest basins. In those dark depths, oxygen often dwindled, creating alien environments hostile to most life. Yet even here, resilience found a way. Microbial mats fed on chemical reactions, creating ecosystems that mirrored those of the Messinian brine pools, echoes of the crisis preserved in miniature. The Mediterranean was not just a sea of sunlight and surface abundance, but also of hidden darkness, where life survived in silence and strangeness. The tectonic stage remained active too. Africa's northward march pressed onward, crumpling the crust into mountains and tearing it into trenches. Earthquakes rattled coasts, sometimes reshaping rivers or collapsing cliffs into the sea. Volcanoes continued to remind the basin of its fragility. Etna, Stromboli, and Vesuvius, fed by forces deep within the earth, erupted with fire that reached the sky, turning day to night with clouds of ash. Some eruptions triggered tsunamis that raced across the sea, striking distant coasts with sudden fury. The Mediterranean's beauty was never free of danger. It was always a balance between fertility and destruction. The Sahara to the south remained the sea's restless partner. In wetter intervals, rivers carved their way north, flowing into the Mediterranean, carrying fresh water and sediments that fed its ecosystems. Fossilized riverbeds crossing the desert are evidence of these green ages, when the Sahara bloomed with lakes and grasslands. In drier intervals, the desert expanded, and dust storms swept across the basin, painting sunsets crimson and fertilizing plankton blooms in the water. This dialogue between desert and sea, aridity and abundance, shaped the rhythms of the entire region. It was in this shifting world that early humans eventually appeared on the stage. The Mediterranean was both barrier and gateway, both obstacle and promise. At times, low seas exposed paths that allowed migrations from Africa into Europe. At other times, straits widened, forcing humans to navigate coasts and invent new ways of crossing water. Archaeological evidence suggests that even in the deep past, long before the rise of civilizations, hominins found their way across the Mediterranean's narrower channels. The sea that had once vanished now stood as a test of ingenuity, pressing humanity toward exploration. The memory of disappearance lingered even into human imagination, though no person had ever seen the Messinian Crisis. Myths of floods, of seas created or destroyed by divine will, may have drawn inspiration from the scars left in stone. Fossils of sea creatures high in mountains suggested vanished oceans. Drowned valleys whispered of lands swallowed by water. Ancient storytellers, gazing at these landscapes, wove tales of punishment, renewal, and rebirth. The Mediterranean's lost chapter was not entirely forgotten. It lived on as myth, transmuted into stories of gods and catastrophe. And still, beneath its waves, the Mediterranean was alive with contradictions. It gave life in abundance, feeding creatures and shaping climates, yet it remained vulnerable to the same forces that had once destroyed it. The inflow from Gibraltar, narrow and fragile, remained its lifeline. Without it, the Mediterranean would begin to shrink again, evaporating into desert within a geological blink. Every tide surging through the strait was both a gift and a reminder of impermanence. The sea was alive, but its life depended on a doorway no wider than a narrow channel of stone. To imagine standing on its coast in these ages is to see beauty laced with tension. Waves lap gently at the shore, yet the mountains behind quake with the force of tectonics. Birds wheel overhead in migration, yet the desert beyond the horizon waits to spread its sands. Fish dart through the shallows, yet deep below, brine pools glimmer as reminders of death. The Mediterranean was a paradox sea, suspended between survival and collapse, abundance and silence. Its story was far from finished. For though it had vanished once and returned, its cycles were not yet done. The earth would continue to test it, pressing the plates, shifting the climate, challenging the fragile lifeline at Gibraltar. And when humans came to settle its coasts, to sail its waters, to build empires upon its shores, they would inherit not only its abundance, but also its fragility. They would build their future on a sea that had died once, never knowing how close it always hovered to disappearance. And so the Mediterranean endured, resilient, fertile, restless, and haunted. A sea born from absence, alive with contradictions and balanced on the knife edge of survival. The silence of the Messinian desert lay buried, but it was not gone. It whispered beneath the waves, a memory pressed into stone, waiting for the next turn of Earth's restless hand. The Mediterranean, long after its violent rebirth, became more than a sea. It was a boundary etched into the map of the Earth, a fulcrum upon which climate, geology, and life balanced with precarious precision. Its waters sparkled under the sun as if eternal, yet beneath that brilliance lay a constant tension. Every tide that surged through Gibraltar was a reminder of fragility, every shift of tectonic plates a rehearsal for change. The memory of the Messinian Crisis did not vanish. It endured in silence, written into the bones of the land, the chemistry of the water, and the myths that would one day shape civilizations. Over millions of years, the rhythms of glacial and interglacial cycles sculpted the basin again and again. During glacial peaks, sea levels fell, shrinking the Mediterranean and exposing coastal plains that transformed into fertile corridors of migration. Rivers like the Nile, the Rhone, and the Po extended far beyond their modern mouths, cutting across landscapes now submerged. Herds of animals grazed on these exposed lands. Elephants, aurochs, and antelope herds roamed where waves now break. But with each warming, the glaciers retreated, sea levels rose, and the Mediterranean reclaimed its breadth, drowning those plains in silence once more. It was a cycle of creation and erasure, a sea teaching the lesson that nothing endures unchanged. On the islands, evolution left its strangest signatures. Isolated by rising waters, creatures adapted in ways unseen on the mainland. Fossils from places like Crete and Cyprus reveal populations of dwarf elephants, some scarcely taller than a human, shaped by limited resources and the absence of large predators. On Malta and Sicily, giant swans once walked the ground, their wings shrunken, their bones heavy, transformed by the peculiar alchemy of isolation. These species lived and died in fragile balance, their entire existence dependent on sea levels and climate that shifted with glacial rhythms. The Mediterranean was both their sanctuary and their executioner. Beneath the surface, the basin remained restless. Its deep waters were saltier and heavier than the Atlantic, prone to stagnation and oxygen loss. In the deepest troughs, life retreated, replaced by chemical processes that supported strange microbial communities. These abyssal zones echoed the Messinian pools of brine, tiny living memories of the vanished desert. Above them, however, the sea teemed with life. Phytoplankton bloomed in great swirling patches, fueling shoals of fish that darted like liquid silver through the currents. Dolphins hunted along the coasts, whales passed through on long migrations, and sharks patrolled the deep. The Mediterranean became once more a sea of abundance, but an abundance perched always on the knife edge of imbalance. The Sahara to the south remained both adversary and partner. At intervals, when rainfall increased across North Africa, rivers flowed again, carving valleys and feeding the sea with torrents of fresh water. These green phases of the Sahara transformed it into a landscape of lakes, savannas, and forests, linking Africa and the Mediterranean in pulses of fertility. In drier times, the desert expanded, choking life and sending storms of dust into the sea. These storms fertilized plankton blooms, but they also reminded the Mediterranean of its vulnerability to forces beyond its shores. It was a sea defined as much by the desert as by the ocean that fed it. Geological unrest continued to sculpt its boundaries. The African plate pressed relentlessly into Eurasia, raising mountain chains and triggering earthquakes. In the Aegean, the crust stretched and tore, birthing new islands and sinking others. Submarine landslides, destabilized by buried salt layers, sometimes collapsed with catastrophic force, sending waves surging across the basin. Volcanoes remained vigilant. Etna spewed lava across Sicilian slopes, Stromboli pulsed like a beacon of fire, and Vesuvius built itself up in quiet centuries before releasing devastation. These were not random eruptions, but part of the Mediterranean's deep memory, a reminder that its beauty was inseparable from violence. As humanity entered the stage, the Mediterranean had already rehearsed countless cycles of disappearance and return. Early hominins, venturing out of Africa, encountered it as both obstacle and pathway. During times of low sea levels, the narrowing of straits and exposure of land bridges allowed crossings into Europe. In other times, when waters rose, humans were forced to adapt, to hug coastlines, to craft vessels capable of short passages. Evidence of early stone tools on islands suggests that humans, or their close relatives, had braved these waters far earlier than once believed. The Mediterranean, even in prehistory, was shaping ingenuity, pressing humanity toward exploration and adaptation. Its influence extended beyond migration. The sea's climate stability created fertile valleys where early agriculture would one day flourish. Its coasts, rich with fish, provided steady food for growing populations. Its currents, predictable and swift, would eventually carry ships, trade, and ideas between continents. But long before the first city was built, the Mediterranean was already a stage for human destiny, setting the parameters of survival and opportunity. The vanished sea of the Messinian had left behind not only scars but also the conditions that would one day nurture civilization. The myths that would later surround the Mediterranean may carry echoes of its geological past. The memory of vanished seas and catastrophic floods is woven into stories of deluge, punishment, and rebirth. The Greek tale of Poseidon's wrath, the biblical flood, the legend of Atlantis, each reflects humanity's attempt to explain landscapes marked by violence far older than memory. Fossils of marine creatures found high in mountains told of oceans where none now existed. Drowned valleys hinted at lands swallowed by water. The earth's scars were transformed into myth, and myth into identity. To stand on its shores in these ages was to sense both abundance and unease. The air carried salt and the cries of seabirds, waves shimmered in sunlight, and forests stretched down to the water's edge. Yet earthquakes shook the ground without warning. Volcanoes erupted in fire and ash. Storms swept suddenly from horizon to horizon. Beauty and danger existed side by side, inseparable, as though the sea itself remembered its past and refused to let any who lived near it forget. The Mediterranean had vanished once, and it would never stop carrying that truth. Every salt deposit buried beneath its sea floor, every drowned canyon hidden in darkness, every restless volcano along its rim testified to fragility. This was not an eternal sea, but a survivor, a body of water that endured only because a narrow strait remained open to the Atlantic. That strait, fragile and finite, was its lifeline and its vulnerability. And so the Mediterranean endured, shimmering in the present but haunted by the shadow of its own disappearance. For humans who would one day settle its shores, build their cities, and set their sails upon its waters, it was a gift beyond measure. But it was also a reminder of impermanence, of how easily seas can vanish, and how even abundance rests on borrowed time. The question pressed forward into the ages: was this sea truly eternal, or was it only pausing between cycles, waiting for the earth to rewrite its story once again? The Mediterranean, by the time humanity's first sparks of civilization began to glow along its shores, was already a sea carrying the weight of deep memory. To those who gazed across its waters in the Stone Age, it must have seemed eternal, a horizon that stretched without end, feeding them with fish and reflecting the rising sun. Yet beneath their feet lay a history of desolation, a vanished sea that had once left behind salt deserts and canyons deeper than imagination. They could not have known it, but the myths and fears that took root in their minds may have been echoes of a geological truth written into the land long before they arrived. By the Neolithic age, when agriculture spread across its fertile valleys, the Mediterranean had become not only a source of food, but a stage for human settlement. Its coasts were dotted with villages, its islands became stepping stones for trade, and its rivers served as veins carrying life into its heart. The rhythms of the sea-shaped calendars and rituals, tides and storms were woven into stories of gods and spirits, while the mystery of the horizon ignited the imagination. What people saw as divine temper could have been the restless legacy of the Messinian Crisis: earthquakes, tsunamis, and shifting coastlines reminding them that this sea was alive with forces beyond their control. Archaeological traces suggest that early communities recognized the Mediterranean as both gift and danger. Caves along its coasts preserve bones of animals that no longer exist, remnants of the strange evolutionary experiments of its islands. The dwarf elephants of Cyprus, the giant swans of Malta, the rodents of Crete, all were gone by the time humans arrived, erased by shifting sea levels and eventually by hunting and competition. Yet their memory may have lingered in legend, woven into tales of strange beasts inhabiting distant lands. Even in absence, the sea whispered of uniqueness, of worlds that rose and vanished at the mercy of its tides. The Mediterranean's geology continued to assert itself during these human ages. Volcanoes such as Etna, Stromboli and Vesuvius remained vigilant, spewing ash and fire that reshaped landscapes. Earthquakes rattled coasts, sometimes swallowing villages, sometimes raising new ground from the depths. Tsunamis, born of submarine landslides or volcanic collapse, swept across islands without warning, their violence leaving marks in sediment and memory alike. To early societies, these were acts of gods, punishments, or omens. To the earth, they were reminders that the basin was never still, that beneath its calm waters lay restless forces waiting for release. The climate, too, bore the influence of the sea. Its currents and storms regulated rainfall, feeding the valleys of the Nile, the Tigris, and the Euphrates. Fertile soils, nourished by sediments washed into the basin, supported agriculture that spread from one shore to another. Yet the sea was also capricious. Drought struck when currents shifted, forcing communities into migration or collapse. The Mediterranean was both cradle and challenge, offering life with one hand and threatening it with the other. It was precisely this duality that made it so formative. Civilizations flourished because they learned to adapt to its rhythms, to respect its unpredictability, and to fear its sudden violence. As human cultures spread along its coasts, the Mediterranean became more than a physical presence. It became a cultural axis. Myths told of great floods, of islands lost to the sea, of gods who commanded water as punishment or mercy. The story of Atlantis, the biblical flood, the deluge of Mesopotamian epics, all carried echoes of a truth older than humanity itself. The Mediterranean had once vanished, and though no human eye had seen it, the scars in stone and soil were legible enough to inspire stories of worlds drowned, or deserts reclaimed by water. What geology remembered in silence, myth remembered in song. The sea's unique position as a narrow, semi-enclosed basin made it unlike any other. Its dependence on Gibraltar remained absolute. Without that lifeline to the Atlantic, the balance would collapse. Ancient people did not know the mechanics, yet they felt its precariousness. They built altars and temples near its coasts, perhaps instinctively aware that the sea was never fully safe. Storms could erase fleets. Earthquakes could tilt the ground beneath them. Volcanic ash could choke the sky. The Mediterranean demanded reverence not only as provider, but as force. Even today, geologists see the legacy of the Messinian Crisis in modern hazards. The salt deposits buried deep beneath the seafloor continue to deform, creating domes that shift sediments and destabilize slopes. Submarine landslides triggered by these movements can release tsunamis across the basin. The very memory of absence continues to shape the present, making the Mediterranean both fertile and volatile. It's a reminder that history never ends. It only hides in layers of stone, waiting to return. To stand on its shores in the Bronze Age, watching ships carved from cedar and oak push into its waves, would have been to see a sea alive with trade and culture. Yet every port, every voyage was shadowed by uncertainty. Sailors feared storms that could rise from clear skies, feared coasts that could collapse into the water, feared volcanoes whose fire could reach across the sea. The Mediterranean was already central to human life, but it remained inscrutable, as much mystery as gift. And still, Beneath all its rhythms, the great question endured: how permanent could any sea be? Humanity's memory is short compared to the Earth's. Civilizations measure time in centuries, but the Mediterranean measures it in millions of years. To the sea, cities and empires are fleeting. To the land beneath, the silence of its vanished desert is still fresh, the salt still shifting, the fractures still widening. Humanity would one day call this sea eternal, yet eternity was never its nature. The Mediterranean carried on, shimmering, abundant, dangerous. Civilizations would rise and fall upon its shores, myths would be written upon its tides, wars would be fought across its horizon. But deep beneath, the memory of the Messinian Crisis endured, whispering a warning that seas can die, that oceans are fragile, and that what seems eternal is always only temporary. The sea had returned, but its shadow remained, and as empires began to gather on its shores, as ships began to carve paths across its surface, humanity would unknowingly inherit not only the gifts of this sea, but also the fragility that lay beneath. For the Mediterranean was not simply a stage for human history, it was a reminder of the Earth's power to erase, to silence, and to begin again. By the time great civilizations had anchored themselves to its coasts, the Mediterranean appeared to humanity as a timeless sea. Phoenician traders steered across its waters with confidence. Greek philosophers watched the horizon as if it reflected the divine, and Roman generals marched along its shores believing they had tamed it. To them, it was Mare Nostrum, our sea, a body of water so central to life that it seemed beyond the reach of change. Yet beneath their feet, hidden in the layers of stone and salt, the memory of its disappearance lingered. What humanity celebrated as eternal was, in truth, a survivor balanced on fragile ground. The forces that had once emptied the basin had not vanished. Africa continued its slow advance northward, colliding with Eurasia, warping the crust into mountains and trenches. Earthquakes rattled cities from Crete to Carthage, levelling temples in moments. Volcanoes like Vesuvius and Etna roared without warning, burying villages in fire and ash. At sea, landslides triggered tsunamis that tore through harbours, destroying fleets in minutes. To ancient peoples, these were acts of gods or punishments for hubris. To the earth, they were reminders that the Mediterranean's beauty had always been tied to violence. Even as empires rose, the sea itself remained restless. Its salinity stayed higher than the Atlantic, demanding constant inflow through Gibraltar to survive. In years of drought or climatic instability, the balance tilted. Ancient sailors would have noticed subtle changes, the water becoming heavier, currents shifting in unfamiliar ways. They could not have known that these were echoes of the Messinian Salinity Crisis, a time when the sea had vanished, leaving behind salt plains that still lay buried beneath their ships. Every voyage across the Mediterranean was unknowingly taken over a graveyard of ancient silence. The people who lived along its edges created myths that echoed its past. Flood stories, from the Epic of Gilgamesh to the biblical deluge, spoke of waters that swallowed lands in punishment or renewal. Greek myths told of Poseidon's fury, of Atlantis swallowed by the sea, of islands rising and sinking beneath divine wrath. These were not direct memories. No human had witnessed the Messinian Crisis, but landscapes scarred by catastrophe-shaped imagination. Fossils of seashells embedded in mountains, drowned valleys visible in the shallows, and sudden eruptions that turned day to night. All of these wove themselves into myth, humanity's way of remembering what geology had written long before. The Mediterranean shaped not only myth, but history itself. Its currents carried Phoenician ships westward to establish colonies in Iberia and North Africa. Its islands became stepping stones for Greek city-states to expand their influence. Rome, rising from its heart, called it Mare Nostrum because control of its waters meant control of the known world. Trade routes crisscrossed its expanse, carrying grain from Egypt, silver from Spain, spices from the Levant. Yet for all its abundance, the sea remained a fickle partner. Storms rose without warning, wrecking fleets and erasing fortunes. Coastal cities thrived, but they also lived with constant vulnerability, perched on a basin that remembered absence even as it offered abundance. Volcanoes in particular reminded humans of fragility. The eruption of Thera in the Bronze Age destroyed the Minoan civilization and may have inspired myths of Atlantis. Centuries later, Vesuvius buried Pompeii and Herculaneum beneath ash, freezing in time a civilization that had believed the sea eternal. Each eruption was a revelation. The land and sea were never still, and beneath their surface lay forces that could erase empires as easily as they had once erased the sea itself. The Sahara, too, remained part of the Mediterranean story. Its cycles of greenness and desolation influenced the sea's rhythms. During wetter phases, rivers carved across North Africa, bringing fresh water and nutrients to the sea, supporting trade and agriculture on its southern shores. During arid phases, dust storms swept across the basin, choking crops and shifting climates. Ancient peoples may not have traced these patterns to the dialogue between desert and sea, but they lived with the consequences. The Mediterranean was not only a cultural hub, it was a climatic hinge on which the fate of whole regions turned. The geology of the sea continued its hidden work. The salt deposits buried beneath its floor shifted slowly, forming domes that warped sediments and created pockets where oil and gas accumulated. Earthquakes, sometimes devastating, often originated from the same pressures that had once sealed the basin from the Atlantic. The Mediterranean's history was not locked in the past, it was still being written, slowly, invisibly in the deep. To the civilizations that flourished along its shores, the Mediterranean gave identity. The Greeks called themselves children of the sea, their myths born from its waves. Rome's empire spread outward as much through its naval power as through its armies. Egyptian grain sustained millions through Mediterranean trade, while Carthage grew wealthy from controlling its routes. Yet for all the confidence of these empires, none could escape the truth. The sea was not theirs to command. It was older, more patient, more powerful than any human order. Their fleets might cross it, their armies might fight upon its coasts. But the Mediterranean carried within it a silence that could return in an instant. To stand on its shores during the height of Rome, watching ships sail across the horizon, was to see a sea that seemed permanent. And yet, even then, the Strait of Gibraltar remained its narrow throat, its single lifeline to the Atlantic. If tectonics shifted just slightly, if mountains rose again to block that passage, the Mediterranean would begin to wither. Salt would crystallize, canyons would deepen, and within geological moments the sea would vanish once more. Rome called it eternal, but eternity is not in the nature of seas. The Mediterranean had disappeared once, and its survival depended on thresholds as fragile as stone. To human eyes, it was a sea of abundance, a theatre of culture and conquest. But to the earth, it was only an episode in a cycle, a pause between vanishing and return. Civilizations built their myths and empires upon its waters, but the sea itself remembered what they did not, that oceans can die, that deserts can take their place, and that nothing, not even Mare Nostrum, was ever truly eternal. And so, even as the Mediterranean flourished as the heart of the ancient world, its deeper story remained hidden, waiting to be uncovered by time. The waves carried trade and war, song and myth, but beneath them lay salt and silence. The paradox endured, a sea of life, resting on the memory of its own death. And as the empires rose and fell, one question lingered beneath it all. How long can abundance last when built on fragility? The Mediterranean has always been more than a sea. To the civilizations that flourished upon its shores, it was destiny itself, a corridor of trade, a theatre of conquest, a mirror for gods and myths. Yet beneath the sails and empires, beneath the cities and stories, it has always carried the memory of something deeper that it once vanished. Its waters, so central to culture and survival, had not always been there. 6 million years ago, the sea emptied into silence, leaving behind salt plains and canyons deeper than the Grand Canyon, only to be reborn in a flood so immense it reshaped the earth. That truth, hidden in stone and sediment, lies beneath every wave. Today, to look upon the Mediterranean is to see beauty so familiar it feels eternal. Sunlight scatters across blue horizons, cliffs plunge into emerald bays, and islands dot the water like scattered jewels. But its elegance conceals fragility. The Mediterranean evaporates more than it receives, surviving only because the Atlantic continually replenishes it through Gibraltar's narrow strait. If that passage were sealed by tectonic forces, the cycle of desiccation would begin again. The sea's survival is not guaranteed. It rests on thresholds thinner than human imagination allows. This fragility gives the Mediterranean its paradoxical character. It is both timeless and temporary, abundant yet precarious. It nurtures biodiversity, but its deep waters often stagnate, starving life of oxygen. It carries ships and trade, but it also hides tectonic scars that can release earthquakes, landslides, and tsunamis without warning. It moderates climates across Europe and Africa, yet it remains vulnerable to even slight shifts in global weather. The Mediterranean has endured as the cradle of civilizations, but its endurance has never meant permanence. The myths humanity wove around it may in some way reflect this unease. Atlantis swallowed by the sea, Noah's flood, Poseidon's wrath, the deluge in Gilgamesh, all are stories of abundance erased, of oceans overwhelming or vanishing, of gods reminding mortals of their limits. These myths may not be memories of the Messinian Crisis, but they resonate with landscapes shaped by catastrophe. Fossils of seashells in mountains, drowned valleys beneath the waves, and volcanoes that could annihilate cities in moments gave substance to fears older than memory. Myth became a language for what geology had already written, that nothing lasts forever, not even seas. For the civilizations of antiquity, the Mediterranean was both lifeline and threat. The Minoans thrived on Crete until a volcanic eruption shattered their world. The Greeks built myths around its islands. The Romans named it our sea and bound their empire to its currents. Egypt depended on its connection to sustain grain routes that fed millions. Carthage grew rich from trade, only to fall to Roman power fought across its waters. Every empire along the Mediterranean rose with the gifts of the sea and carried within it the seeds of fragility. One eruption, one flood, one shift in climate could alter the balance. Today the Mediterranean still whispers of its ancient silence. Geologists probing its seafloor uncover thick salt deposits left behind during its disappearance. Seismic images reveal drowned canyons hidden beneath sediments. Brine pools at the bottom echo the desiccation's extremes, tiny windows into a past when the basin was a desert. Every discovery reminds us that the Mediterranean is not eternal. It is a survivor of cycles, a piece in the rhythm of Earth's restless transformations, and those cycles are not finished. Africa continues to press north, closing the basin ever tighter, building mountains that may one day seal it off once more. Climate shifts test its resilience, with warming waters, altered salinity, and changing currents already reshaping ecosystems. The Mediterranean's fragility is not a relic, it is a present reality. What happened 6 million years ago could happen again, though on a timescale far longer than human lifetimes. The lesson it carries is not confined to geology, it is a reminder of how precarious abundance always is. To stand on its shores now, watching waves break against cliffs, is to feel both awe and humility. This sea has seen deserts bloom, rivers carve gorges into stone, civilizations rise and fall, and myths etched into memory. It has been absent and present, silence, and abundance. It reminds us that the Earth's story is larger than ours, that the forces shaping seas and continents operate on scales that dwarf empires. The Mediterranean exists not because it is permanent, but because it has endured through change, carrying forward the paradox of fragility and resilience. And perhaps that is the truest lesson of the Mediterranean's disappearance and return, that beauty is never eternal, but that impermanence itself creates meaning. Its waves shimmer precisely because they could vanish. Its abundance matters because it is not guaranteed. To know the Mediterranean is to recognise the tenuous balance upon which all seas rest, and to see in its memory a reflection of our own fragility. The day the Mediterranean disappeared is not just a story of geology. It is a story of life adapting to extremes, of ecosystems erased and reborn, of a planet that remembers even when we forget. It is a reminder that oceans are not eternal, that what seems permanent is always temporary, and that survival is always borrowed time. And as the waves lap against the present-day shores of Spain, Italy, Greece, and Egypt, the silence of that vanished desert still lingers, waiting, a whisper beneath the blue. For the Mediterranean is not simply a sea. It is a paradox, a survivor, a memory written in stone and salt. It is proof that even the greatest waters can vanish, and that return is never guaranteed. And in its fragile endurance lies a question that belongs not only to the past but to us. When the Earth writes its next chapter, will the Mediterranean remain, or will it once again dissolve into silence?